Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University. And today I'm happy to be joined by more than a dozen colleagues from other universities across the US and Europe as we discuss the edited volume that has just come out on social media and democracy, which is, to my knowledge, the most significant compilation of research on this topic that has been published to date. So really looking forward to the conversation today, which we are hosting in collaboration with our colleagues at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU. Before jumping into the agenda, I'm going to go through it in detail so folks know what we have planned. I want to first just share a couple of words about the Cyber Policy Center for anyone who is not familiar. The center focuses all of our research and teaching on the governance of digital technology when it comes to questions around security, geopolitics, and democracy. And we're home to a half dozen programs, about half of which have leadership represented on today's call, as they have all authored chapters as part of this edited volume. So really looking forward to the conversation today. In terms of an agenda, we're going to have a couple of introductory remarks, first from my colleague Zeev Sanderson, who directs the Center on Social Media and Politics at NYU. And then we will turn from Zeev to hear from Jason Rohde at the Social Science Research Council, who has been gracious enough to help make public a free version of this volume. And then after that, we will share a few words from our co-editors, Nate Persley and Josh Tucker. Nate is a professor at Stanford Law School and is the faculty co-director of the Cyber Policy Center. And Josh is the co-director of the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU and is a professor of politics there. Once we get through introductory remarks, we're going to turn to Andy Guess at Princeton University, who, in collaboration with his colleague Benjamin Lyons at the University of Utah, authored the chapter on misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, which looks at what we know about the prevalence of these items online. And then we'll turn to Adam Berinsky and Chloe Wittenberg at MIT, who wrote a chapter on correcting misinformation, and we'll speak to how challenging this is given human nature and what we know about things like motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. And then from there, we will turn to Alexandra Siegel, who was at Stanford and I believe is now at Colorado University, who will talk about her chapter on online hate speech, exploring the prevalence and impact and what we know about how this varies across different social media platforms. From there, we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll turn to our next three chapters. We'll hear first from Sam Woolley at the University of Texas at Austin about bots and computational propaganda and what automation and anonymity has done to our online information environment. And then from there, we'll turn to Rasmus Kleist-Nielsen and Richard Fletcher at Oxford University, and Rasmus will speak to the effect of a changing media landscape on democracy and what we know about that. Then from there, Travis Rideau from Washington State University will share what he and co-authors Erica Franklin Fowler at Wesleyan University and Michael Franz from Bowdoin College know about online political advertising in the United States, which is the largest purveyor of online political ads in the world. And they will speak to what makes these so hard to govern and what the platforms have been trying in terms of online ad archives. We'll then take another 10-minute break and then spend 20 minutes on each of the next three chapters. We'll turn first to Frank Fukuyama and Andy Gradu, who both direct programs here at the Cyber Policy Center, and they will speak to comparative media regulation in the US and Europe, with a particular focus on France and Germany, looking at how those countries have governed past communications technologies and how that has translated into their attempts to govern the internet. From there, we'll turn to Robert Gora, who will present what he and his co-author Timothy Garton-Ash from Oxford University have done to explore democratic transparency in the platform society, looking at how transparency began in the governance space, then moved to corporations, and then more recently attempts to increase transparency on the internet. And then finally, we'll hear from our colleague Daphne Keller, who runs a program on platform regulation here at the Cyber Policy Center, and her colleague Patty Learson at the University of Virginia, who have talked about empirical research on internet platforms and content moderation based on Daphne's knowledge of the intermediary liability field and looking at how hard it is and some of the challenges with managing content online. And then finally, we will turn to some closing remarks from our co-editors, Josh Tucker and Nate Pursley, and we will close sharply at 1 p.m. So we have a very tight agenda, and I will be extremely militant in trying to keep us on time. We will have 20 minutes for each of the chapters, and those 20 minutes will be divided with 5 to 10 minutes from the chapter authors presenting their remarks, and then another 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. So please go ahead and enter your questions in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer them. We will start out with Josh Tucker and Zeev Sanderson from NYU moderating the first few chapters, and then Nate and I will be moderating the last few chapters. So wish us all luck, given the number of people on the line. And with that, I will turn it over, Zeev, to just a moment of remarks from you, and then to Jason, and then to Nate and Josh. So thank you all for joining us. Looking forward to this.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and thanks to the team at the Cyber Policy Center for organizing today's event. As Kelly mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, and we're really thrilled to be co-sponsoring today's symposium. By way of context for folks on this call who might not be familiar with the center, we support research in 3 core areas. We study the relationship between social media and politics. We use social media data to study politics in innovative ways, and we develop open source tools that enable others to do the same. And although our own research agenda focuses on the scientific analysis of social media's effect on politics, I'm especially excited about both the new volume in today's symposium, because as Nate and Josh write, and I'm sure we'll talk about today, this is a much needed context in which to bring together the policymaking and academic communities that are too rarely left in their disciplinary silos. I also wanted to mention in this regard that we'll be hosting a panel series in the lead up to the election that highlights recent scholarly work on a number of policy relevant topics, and I'll drop information in the chat box about how you can learn more. So again, a big thanks to Kelly and her team for making today happen. I can't think of a better way to officially start fall, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
Great, thanks, Zeev. Jason, do you want to say a quick word or two about the Social Science Research Council's role here?
Sure, thanks. Good morning. Thanks, Kelly. I'm very glad to join you this morning to welcome everyone on behalf of the Social Science Research Council, and also just to congratulate all the authors and editors of this important and timely volume. I am a program director at the SSRC, where I direct the Social Data Initiative, the MediaWell program, and also the co-direct the Media and Democracy program. And for some of you who might be less familiar with the SSRC, we're an independent international nonprofit founded in 1923 and located in Brooklyn, New York. So for nearly 100 years, we've fostered innovative research, and we've nurtured new generations of social scientists, mainly through our extensive fellowship offerings and other research programs. Through collaborative work with universities and policymakers and foundations and others, we really seek to mobilize social science for the public good. So this book has ties to 2 SSRC programs: Anxieties of Democracy, which was founded by former SSRC President Ira Katznelson, and with the support of the Hewlett Foundation, and that program sponsors this book series. And secondly, with support from the Knight Foundation, the complementary Media and Democracy program was added to foster additional research on rising polarization in a swiftly changing media environment driven by social data. So we launched Media and Democracy's ongoing public series of research workshops with a 2018 conference organized with Nate Pursley and Diana Mutz, entitled Social Media and Democracy, Assessing the State of the Field and Identifying Unexplored Questions, which helped frame the current volume here. But this newly released book builds upon that earlier conference in really important ways, not least of which by articulating the lessons that researchers have learned in the recent years, and plainly outlining several necessary steps for research to be able to proceed in the coming years. So reflecting our commitment to open scholarship, we're very excited to be able to support the open access version of this new book, which you can download for free from Cambridge University Press's website. And for those of you who are interested in these ongoing issues, I do invite you to visit SSRC's platform, MediaWell, which is a platform that daily gathers news and research on dis and misinformation. We offer research reviews that provide an overview of key topics, and expert reflections that provide historical context. And you can find us at mediawell.ssrc.org. Finally, I just want to thank our many strong partners in the foundation from the foundations, Hewlett and Knight Foundations, the Democracy Fund, the Omidyar Network and Ford Foundation, and others who have supported all of the research, much of the research that you see today and elsewhere in this space. So congratulations to the authors and editors again, and I look forward to today's discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Jason. And Nate, can we now turn to you for a few quick remarks?
Thank you very much. I have been told that my microphone might be a little bit wonky, so I'll be brief. I want to thank everybody who was part of this project. As Jason mentioned, this project started 2 years ago, and as is the case often with edited volumes, right, it took on a life of its own and a very long life. And so we started with this SSRC conference at Stanford. At the same time when we were doing this, Josh and frankly Kelly, through her work at the Hewlett Foundation, were doing work on separate research project dealing with disinformation that came out. And as we were progressing and putting together that conference, it became clear to us that we wanted to provide some volume that would describe the state of the field on social media and democracy. And we made a deliberate decision that we would not just look at the empirical questions dealing with disinformation, hate speech, and the like, but that we would also involve people who were looking at policy questions. Now, it's impossible in one volume to deal with all the empirical questions regarding social media and democracy and all the policy issues. But one of the big motivations in this field, especially for those of us who've been working at the intersection of sort of the social science of social media and democracy and the policy questions, is that those two camps often don't talk to each other. And so we deliberately put those sort of disparate types of chapters together in this volume so that the empiricists would learn a little bit more about the policy questions, and those who are interested in the policy questions would try to learn the facts on the ground. Because as those of us who've been working in the policy realm have learned in the last few years, there is a pretty big gap between policymakers and the social scientists here. Often we're not talking to each other. I want to especially thank the Social Science Research Council for making this this book open access, right? Much as it cuts into the massive royalties that I'm sure Josh and I otherwise would have gotten as a result of this, but we want to make sure that this book gets as broad an audience as possible. And so forward it around so that your students and colleagues learn a lot about it. As you'll see in the chapters that we discussed today, we try to cover the landscape as best as possible that's out there. We've had to update these chapters, it seems, every few months because while we started in the wake of the 2016 election, as we note in the preface, this volume has now experienced sort of all of the questions dealing with social media and democracy, whether through the COVID crisis, the racial justice protests and the like. And now, of course, we have a new election to deal with social media and democracy. So I'm very excited to hear from all the authors. I'll turn it over to my co-conspirator, Josh Tucker.
Okay, thanks very much, Nate. It's a real pleasure to be here at Stanford today and to be here in Greenwich Village in New York City today as well for this joint event sponsored by the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU and the Stanford Cyber Institute. It's been a real pleasure working on this project. Nate basically just said everything I wanted to say. So I'll just go ahead and thank all of the authors who contributed to the volume. It's been incredible working with all of you. We really appreciate this. I just want to reiterate again, this grew out of conversations between Nate and I talking to each other, and Nate and talking about basic scientific research that was being done on social media and democracy, and me saying, you know, policymakers aren't talking about this, and Nate saying as well about the policymakers aren't listening, about the people doing the basic scientific research are not aware of the policy implications of what they were doing. So we decided to try to get this together in one volume. What we hope is this will be a kind of intro volume for people who want to get into the field, but also for people who are deeply into the field to get a sense of parts of the field of which they may not be aware otherwise. It took a lot of people to make this happen. I do also want to give a shout out to Kelly as well, well as the work that was on the basic science side of this volume did grow out of this original report that had been commissioned by the Hewlett Foundation that we published a couple of years ago. And that led us to think about expanding on the work that had been done there, given the voracious appetite for that report when it came out, and combining it with the policy work here. So I want to just thank everybody for joining us here today. It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much. We know the semester's already started. Thank you so much for joining us for some of your time today. I think you will find it won't be wasted. We are incredibly pleased to have so many of the authors from the volume here with us today to share their research. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Andy Guess, who is going to be our first speaker today. Andy?
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay.
All good.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Should I go ahead, Josh, or should I share my screen?
You're up. Go.
Okay, great. Okay. Thanks a lot for having me here. It's really a privilege to be a part of this volume, which, as Josh and Nate said, I see as sort of really setting the agenda on this field as it's just beginning to develop. And I just want to give a shout out to the publishers for making this available open access. I'm already assigning chapters from the book in my syllabus this semester, I think, in no small part due to that fact. So I think that's great. My chapter is called Misinformation, Disinformation, and Online Propaganda. It was co-authored with Ben Lyons at the University of Utah, who's a great colleague of mine. We've collaborated a lot on research on online misinformation. And so to the extent that our volume it speaks to concerns of policymakers, it is in sort of setting some of the terms and definitions and providing some key descriptive facts and an overview of the sort of initial state of the body of evidence on these topics. I'll just give you a brief overview of what our chapter looks like. We start off with basically just a few basic definitions, which I think are generally shared by most of the authors in the volume, and come from another volume that preceded this one on the role of social media and polarization online. So what is misinformation? So misinformation is a claim that contradicts or distorts common understandings of verifiable facts. This is sort of a working definition that we often use by necessity to generally focus on claims that can be directly verified or bolstered by a consensus of authorities. So that limits controversy on factual matters. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we can study claims that are unverifiable, which means that they can't, strictly speaking, be classified as misinformation. So, for example, a claim that the election will be on November 5th, it would be a directly verified falsehood, as would potentially claims about the economic growth in the second quarter. But there are other types of claims that might be unverifiable, at least at the present moment. Disinformation is basically a subset of misinformation that is deliberately propagated. So it's all about a question of intent. So from that 2018 volume, basically we follow that definition, which is that disinformation is meant to deceive, while misinformation could be inadvertent or unintentional. Fake news basically can be thought of as a type of disinformation that is in a certain form. So it's in the form of misleading articles that are designed to mimic the look of actual articles from established news organizations. And then propaganda, we sort of view as any type of communication that's intended to persuade people to support one group over another, often with explicitly emotional appeals. So the focus of the chapter is, like I suggested, on empirical findings, on the production and the consumption and the dissemination of online misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. The first section really covers a lot of the descriptive research that existed when we wrote the chapter. So this is sort of an interesting point that we make throughout. basically social science research today tends to place a premium on causal identification, basically trying to understand the effects of causes, to understand the whys of social processes. But we argue that the state of knowledge on social media and misinformation in particular is unsettled enough at the present moment that assembling basic descriptive data remains a valuable and pressing task. So we see ourselves as sort of at the beginning of accumulating knowledge about this topic. And often one of the first things that researchers need to do is establish empirical regularities and stylized facts, which can then form the basis of more rigorous causal studies later down the line. But it would be a mistake to sort of skip the step of focusing on descriptive research. And there are two sort of challenges here, right? One is, of course, a lot of the existing evidence is proprietary. So as we know, the platforms, house lots of data about people and about what's happening on social media in ways that are often inaccessible to researchers, although this is hopefully changing. Another thing is just that there's just an incredible variety of different experiences and effects on social media that even if experiments could be conducted at a massive scale, it's not clear the extent to which they would generalize, either across people in the present moment or across time. And this is just a general problem with research on social media, and also suggests that there are good reasons to sort of focus efforts on accumulating descriptive knowledge, at least at the present moment, rather than sort of jumping to the sort of the whys. That said, we have a section at the end of the chapter which does look at some of the initial evidence that we have on what the effects of exposure to online misinformation and disinformation might be. I'll talk a little bit about that. So first, I said that we talk about the kind of the production or the supply side of online misinformation. Actually, not all that much is known because it's very hard to study sort of the supply side of misinformation. But I would basically just point to two key findings that we talk about from the research literature. So on the left, this is actually a finding that didn't even make it into the final version of an article that I worked on with my colleagues Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler. But basically, we tried to estimate the relative slant of online fake news in the supply of online fake news in 2016 during the presidential campaign. So in other words, we looked at all of the articles that had been published, not necessarily seen, but published by fake news purveyors during this period and tried to estimate the extent to which they supported one candidate versus another. So not surprisingly, over 90% of the supply of fake news, as far as we could tell, was pro-Trump. So it was overwhelmingly skewed. On the right, so these kinds of dynamics are explored in more ecological depth in a book called Network Propaganda by Benkler et al. And what they do there is they analyze the online news ecosystem and the ways in which they differ between sort of the mainstream media, so that's in blue here on the left, and this what they call a sort of a Breitbart-centered nexus of partisan news here in red. And one of the key arguments that these authors make is essentially that there are differing standards and norms in these two clusters of media. And that the one on the right, so the red that actually seems to circle around Breitbart, tends to have a fairly fluid connections in its network to outright disinformation and propaganda outlets that propagate and amplify fake news. And so the structure of the online news ecosystem is crucial to understanding the supply and also how this types of information is transmitted into the broader media ecosystem. Okay, so moving on from supply, we talk about basically the prevalence of exposure to online misinformation or online fake news on social media. Sort of famously or infamously, I think people's first contact with this research question was actually a quote from Mark Zuckerberg following the 2016 election. The quote was, of all the content on Facebook, more than 99% of what people see is authentic. Only a very small amount is fake news and hoaxes. The hoaxes that do exist are not limited to one partisan view or even to politics. So Mark Zuckerberg said that in 2016, it was sort of met with wide disbelief. So the problem, of course, with this kind of a statement is that people didn't have direct access to the evidence that was being used to make this claim. It actually turns out, perhaps ironically, that some of the subsequent research, to the extent that we can actually assemble our own data, tends to support a view that maybe the number isn't quite as small as 1%, but that exposure to fake news on social media is relatively limited and concentrated. And so one of the first papers that came out about this in 2017 by Alcott and Genskow estimated that American adults saw and remembered slightly more than one fake news article in 2016 during the entire campaign. Some research I did with my colleagues looked at people's clickstream data and estimated first that less than half of all Americans visited any fake news website during the 2016 campaign. And as a share of the news that people were looking at overall, it was about 6%. The Grinberg et al. Study looking at Twitter data likewise estimated that fake news accounted for about 6% of everyone's potential exposure to fake news on Twitter. So how do we square these sort of the various numbers that we see flying around about this? Well, the answer is that the consumption and exposure to online misinformation is highly skewed. So if you look at this graph at the bottom, what this is basically showing is that the vast majority, so more than 60% of visits to online fake news during the run-up to the 2016 election was in the 90th percentile or higher of people with the most homogeneously conservative online news diets. So basically it was being highly concentrated among people who were already exposed to the most partisan pro-Trump information at that time. So some of what I've talked about up to now sort of implies a few rules of thumb when encountering statistics or claims about fake news exposure online. So I'll call your attention to the middle bullet point here. What is the denominator? So you often see sort of large numbers of stories that people encounter or engage with online. But the fact is that people encounter many stories and many pieces of content per day. And so a key question is to ask, what is the denominator? So once we take that into account, for example, we start getting figures like 6% or 1%. Second, averages can obscure skewed distribution. So as I just showed you, exposure to online misinformation tends to be highly skewed because it is concentrated among specific subgroups. And third, exposure, as we've been talking about now, is not the same thing as engagement, which I'll talk about in a second. So what are the effects of online misinformation and disinformation? There are a lot of reasons why we don't know too much about this question, but there have been a few interesting experiments and also natural experiments. So one natural experiment actually looked at the effects of engagement with IRA accounts on Twitter. So earlier this year, Bale et al. Actually took advantage of IRA data that was released by Twitter, and they matched it with a data set of people that they had and the accounts that they engaged with on Twitter. Basically, they were not able to find that there was much of an effect on any of the outcomes that they could measure. So polarization or measures of participation in politics. That doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't effects, just that it was difficult to sort of measure the impact. And so again, sort of the state of the empirical evidence here is a little bit different than the popular narrative, which is one that clearly online misinformation has strong and measurable effects. And here's an example of an experiment that's a recent experiment that I published with a range of co-authors, where we actually tried to do controlled tests of exposure to online fake news. And basically what we find is that fake news is really good at increasing belief in misperceptions, right? So if you show people something that's not true and they read it, they might be more likely to believe the claim. But then if you look at sort of outcomes, downstream outcomes that might come as a result of that, we see more limited evidence. To be clear, we do see that people claim that they're going to be more likely to vote as a result of seeing mock fake news that we show them, which is actually a direction in the opposite effect of the sort of standard belief that fake news can actually demobilize people. But again, I think the state of the evidence here is still pretty early. We cover a number of other things in our chapter. So I've kind of focused on US examples here so far, but we cover, at least at the time of publication, emerging evidence from beyond the US, including Brazil and the EU, and beyond Facebook and Twitter. So WhatsApp is, of course, an area of increasing concern. We also look at increasing evidence on how fake news spreads and why people share it. But sort of just a warning that I think we'll encounter sort of across the presentations is that this is such a fast-moving topic that the state of the research can't be captured even in these chapters that just got published. So 2 of the findings that I just showed you are not even in the final version of our chapter because they came out in less than a year ago. So still, I hope it's sort of a useful roadmap for people as they navigate the growing body of evidence on online misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. So I'll stop there with sort of the overview of what we cover, and I'm happy to sort of take any questions or comments from people.
Thanks so much, Andy. Yeah, we have a couple questions here. One person was wondering if you could comment on the growth of support for QAnon, and whether whether you think there's a connection here to QAnon, to sort of the increasing prevalence of belief in QAnon, to this phenomenon that you're talking about here, about whether or not what's happening in this sphere continues to prime people for thinking that that factual information might be false or false information might be factual.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the rise of QAnon, QAnon's been around for several years, but the sort of explosion of interest and apparent belief in the QAnon conspiracy theory really dates back to the beginning of the pandemic. So we're talking just a few months. So those of us who study this topic, have been continuing to collect data on it, but I think the best answers are still yet to come. But I would basically say 2 things. First is that I have no reason to believe that the specific patterns with regard to QAnon are much different than what this graph shows here, which is that the people who are most likely to encounter information about QAnon, may already be primed to believe other sets of conspiracies. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the journalistic coverage of QAnon, it's often discussed as a sort of mega conspiracy theory that sort of subsumes all other conspiracy theories. And that's in line with research on conspiracy belief, which shows that individuals who believe one conspiracy theory are more likely to believe other conspiracy theories, even if they are logically inconsistent with each other. So at the same time, QAnon tends to have a very specific sort of political slant and political ramifications, which is that the implications of it are all pro-Trump. And again, since we know that exposure to and also sharing of online fake news and online misinformation tends to be highly concentrated, we would also expect that a lot of the QAnon information that's getting spread through social media is mostly making its way to people who are already awash in pro-Trump information or misinformation. And that wouldn't necessarily be obvious from looking at the coverage of some of the top line numbers that are being used to describe the growth and the spread of QAnon on social media. Those are aggregate statistics, which, as we show in our chapter, often mask these individual level differences and the group differences that we argue are so important in understanding the sort of concentration and distribution of exposure to misinformation. And just, I think the other related point to that is just that this is sort of quite related to the network propaganda view that's illustrated in the picture on the right, which is that people who generally get their news from the mainstream sources in blue, will very rarely encounter QAnon information unless it's in the context of a story explaining its rise and sort of debunking its claims, which might be quite different from people who are embedded in networks that sort of repeat these claims over and over again in a less credulous way.
Great, thanks, Andy. I want to thank everyone who's throwing up the questions. We have a great set of questions there, and Andy, maybe you can try to answer some of them in the chat function when we're done. We only have time for one more question at this point. I will note there's someone from Belarus who's watching who wants to hear about research using Telegram, and so we've got that. There's a couple of questions about methodology, about data collection, and how data was procured for doing these studies. But the last question I'm going to ask you is I'm going to kind of combine two. One is, and our previous question I wanted to say was from, we've got a question here from Laura Bosek, who's asking of any idea why fake news is concentrated among conservative news diets? And is this more of essentially, and we find this across a lot of different studies, do you think this is more of essentially a supply effect or a demand effect is the essence of the question? And it's closely related to a question from Carson Mueller, asking whether the skewed distribution of news consumption means should we be worrying more about the impact of misinformation on extreme events such as hate crimes or violent activity versus the sort of more mainstream level effects such as affecting average effects, say, on voting. So combine those two for a last question, and you have 60 seconds to answer both.
Okay, so on the last point, I do think sort of a policy implication is that a focus on extreme misinformation is probably more important. So given the concentration of the spread and exposure of fake news, sort of swaying people to change their votes or their political views is going to be, I think, pretty unlikely. And can you just remind me the first question? Sorry.
Supply versus demand.
Oh, yeah. This is a question that comes up over and over again. The short answer is that we can't really make an inference about whether this is coming from the demand side first or the supply side. But I will say that evidence like what's on the screen right now does strongly suggest that people's consumption behavior and what they see is heavily structured by just the media ecosystem. And there's nothing inevitable about the asymmetries in the distribution of online misinformation that we see. They're certainly true in 2006, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be true in 2024. So I think people shouldn't necessarily take this as sort of a fixed law of the supply of misinformation.
Okay, thanks so much, Andy. I'll note just one final thing looking at the questions. There is definitely, in addition to the Belarusian exhortation for research on Telegram, there is definitely a request for more research and understanding on what's going on in Latin America. And I'm pleased to note that one of the questions came in from Luciana Bauer, who's a federal judge in Brazil and is seeing impacts on polarization in Brazil and would like to see more research going on in terms of both the theme of this volume, what's going on in Latin America, but also in terms of policy implications for it. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker to try to keep this pack scheduled going, who is Adam Berinsky. And Adam is going to speak to us about misinformation and its corrections from his chapter that he co-authored with Chloe Wittenberg. So Adam.
Great,
and
thank
both
you.
at MIT, so take it away.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine. Your video.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen, but I don't see it pop up. So let me start my video. So hopefully that'll pop up now.
We are seeing your screen, Adam.
Okay, you are, awesome, great, thanks.
Yeah,
so I'm Adam Berinsky at MIT, and thanks to the organizers and funders. This chapter is co-authored with a graduate student at MIT, Chloe Wittenberg, who's on this call as well. So I just wanted to say, so you can see the correcting misinformation slide there. Great. Sorry, having technical difficulties here. Okay. So can Josh, can you give me a thumbs up? Do you see misinformation on social media?
Yeah, awesome. We're on your second slide, and we now are not.
Thank you.
Your slide,
okay, I'm like turning into my father in technology. So, but I'm glad you could see this. So in our chapter, we do a bunch of different things. We talk about misinformation on social media, and there's been a lot of concern, obviously, about stopping the spread of that. And we don't have any answers. And those of you who have seen me speak before say, that every time I talk about this, people say, what are the 4 easy things we can do to stop misinformation? And I say, well, there aren't any. And anyone who tells you there are is a snake oil salesman, so you should run away. But what I do talk about is kind of what we can do, some different strategies there, and really kind of using it as the overall strategy of basically throwing up any bunch of stuff against the wall and see what sticks. So there's no single silver bullet, but there might be sort of you can think of a menu of strategies that could work. But what I want to talk about today is about kind of the life cycle, about one thing, about what happens if we just directly contradict or directly correct information on social media. So by fact checkers, by putting say corrections on social media posts, and talk about the life cycle, about the unintended consequences of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one thing that we were worried about, why we shouldn't have been worried, but why we should still be worried. So, this very much, I'll kind of take you through, I think that this illustrates well the difficulty of addressing correcting on social media. So some of you have probably saw this cartoon. This is from the Oatmeal. I didn't put the next slide because it has a few vulgarities in it, which is fine with me, but I figured for 250 people, I wanted to keep that here. But if you look at the Oatmeal comic about the backfire effect, it talked about a phenomenon that was first, there's actually a long-term psychological phenomenon, but was really popularized by Nyhan and Reifler in an early, sort of an early study in the misinformation space, where they basically say that not only are corrections ineffective, but they can sometimes make things worse, right? And so what they say is individuals who receive unwelcome information may not simply resist challenges to their views, but in fact, they might double down and support their original opinions even more strongly. And so this is an old school misinformation, thinking about weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. And so this is the question of, if you're given a correction saying that, in fact, after the 2003 Iraq invasion, weapons of mass destruction were not found, what Nyhan and Reifler said is that if you are liberal, you accept this right away. But if you're conservative, you basically double down. So in fact, having the correction makes it worse than not having anything at all. Now, this drove a lot of worry about social media policy. Gave a talk actually a few weeks ago to a group of political consultants, and this kept coming up again and again. But it turns out that there's a backlash to the backfire, and that work suggests that we don't need to worry about this as much as we thought we did. So Andy Guest has a paper with the co-author, but there's another paper by Wood and Porter where they look at 52 different issues, right? So basically, let's look across the space to see where we can find backfire effects. And they find that essentially people accept factual corrections regardless of their pre-existing views, and they don't find an ideological backfire. So this is just a key graph from them. And I think the key thing to look at here is that the uncorrected and corrected, these slopes look the same, right? That basically there's a mean shift if I give you a correction. Your baseline rejection or acceptance does depend on your ideology, but because these are parallel lines, we don't find the kind of gap that Nyhan and Reifler talked about. So even though this data is presented in a different manner than the graph I showed you before, it basically says that we don't need to worry about the backfire. Now, in the chapter, we kind of dig deeper and say, well, it's reassuring that sharing corrections isn't always going to make things worse, but we want to understand the underlying mechanism. So Chloe and I, in the book, we talk a lot about psychological literature, where there's two psychological paths that we're worried about. The first is the worldview backfire effect, which is active resistance to uncongenial content. So this is basically the backfire effect that Nyhan and Reifler talked about. But we also talk about the continued influence effect. In this case, it's familiarity leads to truth. So kind of stuff that Andy was talking about, the repetition of information. And then just by hearing it more often, you're more likely to have it feel familiar. It's going to be more likely to feel true, and that misinformation is hard to erase. So again, sort of this worldview backfire effect ties to motivated reasoning and disconfirmation bias. But the continued influence effect is tied to something called the illusionary truth effect. In the chapter, we talk a lot more about the kind of mechanism behind this, the psychological research that undergirds it. But the important thing here is that just increased familiarity with information gives the illusion that the information is more valid, right? So this is the case that even if you don't actively resist corrections, misinformation could stick. And so I think one of the big recommendations that we talk about in the chapter is that in the field of misinformation studies, we really need to take a look at to see the overtime effect of corrections, right? So recall that Nyhan and Reifler's study, the Wood study, that in both those cases, they look at the effects of corrections immediately. But what we need to say is that you really need to look at things over time. Corrections fade quickly, but misinformation sticks. And just to kind of give you an example of this that we discuss in the chapter, this is from a paper of mine from 2017, where I look at rumors about death panels in the Affordable Care Act. And here what I find is I look at over waves here. So I know that I'm throwing a lot up there at once, but let me just kind of show you. The wave one is what happens if I give various corrections about the ACA, right? So is there death panels? Are there not death panels? The control, I give them no information. The rumor only, I just talk about the rumor. And then I have different corrections there. And I found that some corrections, in this case, a correction from a partisan that's speaking against their apparent interests, so a Republican who says that there's no death panel, is the most effective correction. But so that's the point of the paper. But what I really want to focus on is what happens when we go to these same people 2 weeks later. Now, if you look at the wave two, right, so this took place 2 weeks after the initial interview, the control remains stable, right? Kind of looking at that rumor rejection rates, 58% reject initially, 57% reject 2 weeks later. The rumor, it sticks, right? That if I present to you the rumor, 43% rejects, that's statistically distinct from the control condition. Same thing 2 weeks later. But if you look at this rumor and nonpartisan correction, for example, right, here we have the AARP saying there are no death panels. You can see that the effect of that correction fades. And this is true regardless of the kind of correction, a nonpartisan, a Republican, a Democrat. But I think what's really important is thinking about the proper baseline, right? So if we compare the control to the rumor and nonpartisan correction, right? So basically saying it's a lot better than rumor only, but it brings us back to that same baseline, right? Only if I bring in the Republican correction, or do we go above the control. But if I go 2 weeks later into wave two, if I gave you the rumor and the correction, you're actually worse off than had I shown you nothing at all. And I think that this ties into this continued influence effect. So to wrap up, saying that, we shouldn't worry about the backfire effect, kind of the active arguing against countermeasures. I think that the scholarly record on this is pretty clear, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about some of the potential downsides of having corrections there, right? So let's not look at the immediate effect. Let's look at the effect even 1 day later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, thinking about how the information environment changes and thinking that we need to focus more on corrections and fact checks over time. And then finally, I think that this is the important point, is thinking about how can we determine the correct baseline for assessing backfire effects, right? That it's not that people counter argue, but we need to assess any interventions against the control. Presenting corrections might cause backlash, but that's not the only worry. As we said, that even though there is not evidence of that, it could be that presenting misinformation and corrections together could still be worse than doing nothing at all. And so I think that this chapter is a review of the research on these different psychological mechanisms, but also a call to research, to taking a view to thinking about long-term interventions and what happens to individuals who are plugged into the kind of media environment that Andy talked about. What happens as they interact with that environment over time? So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam. I want to encourage people, if there are questions, Adam was very prompt, so we have time for questions if you have them for him. We have a question from Paul Gowder, who asked, in terms of long-term belief effects, how would we tease out beliefs versus something like non-attitude in responses? So how long after the salient news do people's surveys responses about things like death panels actually reflect beliefs as opposed to just random answers?
So Paul, that's a really good question. And as I should say, I'm very happy to email me at Berinsky@MIT if you have more questions. This is part of a larger project I've been working on for about 10 years about rumors. And one thing I do want to focus on is this, I focused in the discussion on rumor rejection, but I think a big key is looking at people who say that they're not sure, right? And so this is the question, is saying not sure a non-attitude? For some people, it surely is, saying like, well, I haven't heard of that, I don't know what that is. But I've done some surveys where I do open-ended probes to kind of follow up with folks after they say, where basically I say, do you think that there is, so ask, for example, about Obama's birth certificate. And so I'll say, do you think he was born in the US? And if they say yes, no, or not sure, I do a follow-up and I ask them, well, why do you think that's the case? What I find is that a lot of the people who say not sure are not people who say like, oh, I'm not really, I haven't heard about it. It's saying, I'm not sure because, where there's smoke, there's fire. I've heard a lot about this, right? So I think that it's critical thinking about this correction of misinformation is to focus on these people who say not sure. Because if you look at the kind of these rates about people who accept rumors, and this is true not just in this experiment, but where I've done observational work, other experiments as well, it is really, really hard, if not impossible, to move these people who accept rumors. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, but it does suggest that, if people believe these things, it's going to be really hard to get them to reject that. But if you look at this case of the not sures, you could say that that's a larger group and that people essentially move in and out of that. So I guess what I would say to Paul is, on the one hand, that if the question is a lot of this action through the not sure response, the answer is yes. But does that mean it's less of a problem? I think in many ways it makes it more of a problem because the line between accepting rumors and rejecting rumors is pretty hard and clear, but the line between rejecting rumors and saying you're not sure, the kind of this uncertainty that undermines political conversation, thinking about how people react to the government is very porous and that there's a lot of movement back and forth.
Okay, a lot of great questions coming in here. Two about the nature of the correction. So Aaron Goldzheimer asks, but isn't the important thing how the correction is done? So you could correct by just repeating the falsehood and say it's not true that, which I imagine would increase familiarity with the falsehood, or you could say contrary to that, the truth is, which increases familiarity with the truth. And one closely related to that, Donna Nelson Schneider asks, if people accept factual corrections and you talked about the power of the repetition of information, so this continued influence effect on misinformation, does that mean that would you recommend repeating the correction repeatedly as a way to counter the original rumor misinformation? So you can those two sort of combine with each other.
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. So I think, let me talk about the the method of correction. I think that a lot of this is, sort of thinking about that there's no right way to correct something. To say, I've done some work where, do you negate the falsehood and then have the correction? Brendan Nyhan's done a bunch of stuff as well. Sort of in my work, what I found is having the correction come from an unexpected source. So a Republican who says there aren't death panels, I find that to be most effective. Other folks have used this paradigm and done it in the case of voter fraud, where they found very similar things. So I'd say that what matters is, sort of that there's no right way to do it. So kind of thinking about different ways. But I think that repeating the rumor itself, and in this article, I have cases where I find if you repeat the rumor more than once, it does increase the power of that. Now, for the other question, right, the flip side is, does repeating the correction make it more, right? So basically making the truth more fluid. That's an excellent question. It's something that I'm hoping myself to do with additional research, but I think it does kind of talk about once we're in this setup where we're thinking dynamically about misinformation and correcting misinformation, to think about things over time, right? So we don't when I first started, I first got into this in the summer of 2009, when there was a lot of work about, a lot of talk about the ACA and death panels, Obama citizenship, and thinking like, this is really crazy. Why is it that people believe this? What can we do to correct it? And very much love as kind of a whack-a-mole game, right? It's sort of thinking, okay, I'm gonna write a book. The first part is going to be understanding why people believe these rumors, and the second part is going to be, how we can correct them and move on. And I thought like, I'll be done with that in a couple of years, right? But here we are, more than 10 years later. It used to be that I would have to make the case why this was important. Now the political scene over the last 5 years has shown, that misinformation is important. But I think that kind of moving from a static whack-a-mole kind of thing, where you find misinformation, you correct it, you move on, to this more dynamic case of thinking about, well, how does this work over time? I think changes the kind of questions that we ask and the kind of questions that I ask as well. So, sort of given what we know about the continued influence effect, I would think that repetitions of corrections should be effective. I haven't actually done work on that, but I'm hoping to do so.
Thanks, Adam. I'll point out again, there are now lots of great questions in the Q&A. I'm going to bundle 2 more together, and that'll be the final one here. But if you can take a look afterwards at some of the other ones. We've got, so Laura Bosick says, if repeating a rumor gives it more power, would you recommend that news agencies cover falsehood, fake news, or misinformation from elected officials? And that's underlined by a question, sort of builds on a question from Will Duffield, who had asked, how should we compare top-down misinformation, like things like Iraqi weapons of mass destruction claims, which has an air of legitimacy, with bottom-up misinformation, which may come from fringe sources? So this question of like how we deal with elected officials that are propagating misinformation, and how the news media should be approaching this based on the kind of research that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And there's no easy answers, but I think, let me answer the part. I know I don't have much time, but let me kind of focus on one part of those 2 questions I think is important, is this question of top-down information flow versus bottom-up, right? And so I think what's been really interesting over the last few years, the Trump presidency, is blurring, not just among Trump, but among politicians more generally, in kind of these questions. So someone asked about QAnon, right? So this is something that started as a fringe rumor. It's something that I've been following since it's an offshoot and part of the Pizzagate rumors that happened in the fall of 2016. But Trump was asked about these at a press conference, a couple of weeks ago, and he said, well, I don't know much about it, but I know that they like me, right? And so I think that the line between kind of fringe groups and politicians, and actually the media more generally, I think is not quite as clear as it seems like it should be, right, in terms of thinking about that. So I think it is really hard to figure out how to approach that. So that's kind of a non-answer, but I think that it says that basically, how can we function in a society where misinformation can be generated by the fringe and then amplified by the media, and in some cases by politicians? That Trump kind of rode his initial success on the back of the birther rumor, right? That he didn't create the birther rumor, but he certainly used it for his political ends, and became the president of the United States. And so how can we talk about that in that situation? I'm not really sure, but does underscore the importance, as Andy was saying, of thinking about the supply side versus demand side, thinking about where the misinformation comes from.
Okay, thanks so much, Adam. Really appreciate the time, and of course the effort on the chapter. It was a great, fantastic talk. I'm going to turn it over to Zeev Sanderson, who will moderate the next 2 panels that we've got here. And I will let people know that we will have a short coffee break or bathroom break or whatever you need coming after the next talk. So sit tight for the next talk, and then there will be a short break coming after that. Zeev?
Great, thanks so much, Josh. So our next talk will be from Alexandra Siegel. Alex is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and a faculty affiliate at NYU Center for Social Media and Politics and Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab. And today she'll be speaking about her chapter on online hate speech. So Alex, take it away.
Great, can you all see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks so much to Josh and Nate for kind of having the vision to put this all together, and to Kelly and all of the organizers for making this happen. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the online hate speech chapter, as well as kind of steps forward and where we should go from here based on what we know about the literature. So what is the state of the field? So one of the things that's really exciting, but also difficult about this space is online hate speech research spans such a broad array of fields. We have everything from legal scholarship to computer science to computational linguistics and the social science. And what that means is that there basically is no single agreed upon definition across these different spaces. We generally understand online hate speech to be bias-motivated, hostile, and malicious language targeted at a person or a group because of their actual or perceived innate characteristics. But as we quote in the chapter, even though we have all of this extensive literature about the causes, harms, and responses to hate speech, few scholars have endeavored to systematically define the term. And so without a clear definition, measurement becomes really difficult. And to add complication to this, there's such a wide variety of content that could be considered hate speech in one context or another that it can be very difficult to operationalize. And this is especially true when we consider that online hate speech spans so many different contexts, both within different online communities, but also cultural contexts. And when we put this all together, as I mentioned, it becomes really difficult to operationalize. We have kind of the platform standards of what constitutes hate speech. We have legal definitions, but in general, journalists and anecdotal accounts of hate speech tend to go with more of a you know it when you see it kind of approach to measurement. And so this means that there's a wide variety of methods that have emerged for detecting online hate speech across these different academic fields. And some of them are more effective than others, and all of them have the potential to introduce different types of biases. So most commonly and simply, we have dictionary-based approaches. And the idea here is that there are certain keywords that'll show up regularly in hate speech, such as slurs. And so dictionary-based approaches take known examples of hate speech and search for them across online platforms. But as you can imagine, a lot can go wrong with this, especially in terms of false positives. So to try to correct against this, we've seen the emergence of a lot of supervised approaches. And the idea here is that you have manual human coding of large corpuses of hate speech, which are used to then train classifiers to try to identify them more broadly in the data. There are also rule-based approaches which take into account the grammatical structure of posts in different online platforms. So for example, they're designed to tease out who is the target of online hate speech. We also see unsupervised text classification approaches such as topic models, and then deep learning or neural network approaches. There's a lot of work being done with word2vec in this space, for example. One approach which we use in our research at the SMAP lab at CSMAP is a bag of communities approach. And the idea here is that if you are aware of a known kind of corpus of online hate speech, you can use it to find hateful language in other areas. So in our work, we identify hateful subreddits and then look on a daily basis how similar are tweets to the content of these hateful subreddits to try to get at how the volume and prevalence of online hate speech changes over time. And what's nice about this sort of approach is it's more flexible and can adapt to the changing strategies that different groups putting out hateful content are using sometimes to avoid detection on these platforms. So even though we have all of these really innovative approaches, which have been developed across a variety of academic fields, we have the problem, which is similar to some of what Andy and Adam were describing, that there often aren't tested either across platforms or contexts. So the vast majority of this research has been done on Twitter because that's the place where data access is easiest for academics. But this is, of course, not at all representative of platforms or of hate speech more broadly. And to add to this, most of the research will focus on identifying a particular type of online hate speech, say misogynistic language targeting political officials, which looks very different than other forms of hate speech that we might be interested in detecting and monitoring over time. And as I mentioned, each of these different approaches can come with different kinds of bias. So the example in this image shown here is from the Perspective API, which Google was using to measure toxic content online for a while. And what you can see happens is that content which is clearly not hate speech winds up getting classified as very toxic, even though really similar messages in terms of content don't, because of the presence of certain keywords. And the issue here is, even though this isn't a dictionary-based approach, even though we have humans crowdsourced to train a classifier, different people are not necessarily attuned to norms of language use within different online communities. So someone who is not used to spending time in a particular online space might think that content there is hate speech, even though the members of the community might not identify it this way, which just adds another layer to the difficulty of detection. And then finally, within this space, we know very little just descriptively about the overall volume and prevalence of this language across different chapters, or across different platforms, as well as how it changes over time. And so again, we have this kind of temporal validity issue where if we study online hate speech in 2016, the way online hate speech manifests, even on the same platform among the same users, might look very different today or even just a couple of years afterwards. Another thing I explore in the chapter are different producers of online hate speech. And there's a really wide range here that starts with organized hate groups like neo-Nazi groups that have a long established online presence, for example, that then are using social media platforms to get their messages out. And we also see these kind of explicitly prejudiced online forums that are well known, such as 4chan, 8chan, or Gab, as well as particular subreddits or listservs or sort of sub-components of online platforms that are dedicated to producing hateful language. There are also Twitter accounts, for example, that are active in the white nationalist space that are sort of overtly advertising, even through their Twitter handles, that these are the types of messages that they might be putting out, as well as Facebook pages, which do the same thing and are often coordinated across platforms. To the extent that we know anything about who the primary producers of online hate are, some research suggests that the users are predominantly young and male. We can see that the accounts tend to be new and tightly networked, and they often have a relatively small number of followers. And what's important to highlight is that the activities of these accounts is often very strategic and highly coordinated. So for example, you might have all of these different accounts that are brand new and have small followings, which themselves on a platform like Twitter couldn't get a message to reach a very broad audience. But what they'll do is they'll target popular verified accounts of, say, celebrities or journalists and engage in rating behavior, which is often coordinated on a totally different platform to make hateful content visible on a much wider scale, even though it's only being put out by a relatively small number of accounts that don't themselves have wide followings. So what are the consequences of this online hate speech? I think this is one of the questions from a policy perspective that we're the most interested in, and it's very difficult to measure and get at with the current methods that we have. Survey data suggests that people who are exposed to online hate speech and hostile language often suffer from psychological trauma, and sort of when we think about the relationship between social media and democracy, one harmful side effect of this is that people who are exposed to nasty language online frequently withdraw from civic engagement or expressing their political views in online spaces for fear that they will be targeted. And this is particularly the case for underrepresented minority groups. There's also a consequence of sort of desensitization to harmful content. People get comfortable with seeing language targeting outgroups on a regular basis, and this can contribute to their own perceptions of those groups in a negative way. And then there's a growing body of research, including work by Mueller and Schwartz that's highlighted on the right, which shows that online hate speech is often associated with offline violence. And again, we need a lot more research in this space because this will be very context dependent. But one promising way that researchers have examined this is by exploiting basically naturally occurring breaks that allow them to leverage changes in access to social media to get at these causal effects. So for example, Mueller and Schwartz look at these Facebook blackouts that were occurring in Germany to try to get a sense of how far-right Facebook activity was leading to anti-refugee violence. But again, this is relatively new work, and it's often very difficult to make the leap from just an association between online hate and offline violence to actually identifying a causal effect. What's being done to combat online hate speech? What we hear about the most, especially from the platforms, is content moderation and efforts to ban accounts. And there's some evidence that this can be effective, but what's really challenging is when we're measuring the impact of banning accounts, we're usually looking at only one platform. And so we don't see, for example, if accounts that are producing hate speech are banned on Facebook or Twitter, where they move from there. And from a policy perspective, that might be what we're most interested in. If these accounts begin on a mainstream platform and then move to a much more specialized platform where they're interacting with more extreme actors in a more concentrated echo chamber, this could be more consequential for actually planning offline violence and things of that nature. And so getting a better understanding of how individuals who've been banned from one social media platform move to another is something that's going to be very important in this space. Another thing to bear in mind is that content moderation is not always done with kind of the best of intentions. So there's the platform perspective of removing harmful content, but then, for example, authoritarian regimes often exploit this environment to label dissenting content as harmful speech or hate speech, which should be removed. And so the ability of different actors to kind of operate within these spaces and manipulate content guidelines is something that needs more research as well in this space. Another area that's potentially promising is the rise of counter speech. And counter speech is basically a direct response to hate speech, which is intended to influence attitudes or behaviors. And so there's recent work, for example, from Kevin Munger, who created bots or sock puppets, which responded to people who were producing hateful content in the US context. And he found that receiving a message from a high status peer caused these individuals to use less hate speech moving forward. I have similar research looking at this in the context of Lebanon and also the Arab Gulf, which yields similar findings. But in my work, I also find that receiving messages with counter speech from religious elites was particularly effective. And this just highlights the need to conduct this kind of research in multiple contexts in order to get a better understanding of what forms of counter speech might actually work or not. This is sort of in line with what Adam was saying, is we don't have a silver bullet, and we need to learn a lot more about what types of interventions could cause backlash as well. So where do we go from here? What does this kind of overview of the state of the field tell us? I think the biggest takeaway, and this is something Andy highlighted too, is that we need a lot more descriptive research. And in the social sciences, there's often not a lot of incentive for this kind of collaborative research where multiple researchers in multiple different contexts can look at this one area and use similar measurement strategies and work towards accumulating knowledge. But here we need this both to get at cross-platform spread of hate speech, multilingual hate speech, analysis across different online communities and contexts. What might appear to be hate speech in one corner of the internet might not be in another. And also, again, this need to monitor over longer time horizons. We have all of this great research and sort of efforts devoted to measurement that focus on one small moment of time and one context, but we need more descriptive research to get a sense of how this will generalize. Another big issue here is how researchers can access and sort of have awareness of banned content from platforms without violating their terms of services. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter are constantly banning accounts and deleting content that violates their terms of service. But then for researchers, it's difficult to see what's going on. Sometimes what they're able to observe is only the hate speech that's left over after content has been banned. Or if you're collecting data in real time from Twitter, for example, you can see the banned speech, but technically keeping and analyzing that data violates the platform's terms of service. And so figuring out how researchers and platforms can work together to better access this data and analyze its spread, I think is going to be really important moving forward in this space. The big question that needs answering, which we have very little data on, is what types of dangerous speech are most likely to have offline consequences. Being able to hone in on this is really important for developing content moderation strategies and policies that target the most harmful speech without limiting freedom of speech overall. And within this is the question that I raised earlier, is where do banned users go? From a platform perspective, once the content is no longer on the platform, a platform has done their job. But again, if these users are then traveling to more extreme corners of the internet, the offline consequences from there could potentially be more severe. And we need more work in this space to understand these dynamics over time. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions, and I'll try to respond in the chat to whatever we don't get to in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Alex. So I think we have 2 minutes left before our break. So I think we're going to get to one question that I had that was also posed in the chat, and that was around the sort of question of understanding hate speech in local contexts. So, one of the things that platforms do is they define hate speech globally. And recent sort of journalistic reporting has suggested they often lack the local knowledge and expertise necessary to respond to hate speech effectively. So I was wondering if you could sort of expand upon what research has taught us about how hate speech differs across contexts, and how do you think those differences should impact sort of policies, either from government or platforms?
Thanks, Steve. So this is a really important question, and what's unfortunate is that most of the research on online hate speech has focused on the US context or Western contexts more generally. And so we really don't have a lot of systematic research to get at this question of how this might look different in different local contexts and what forms of counter speech or interventions might be most effective at combating the spread of this language in these different environments. I think one thing that has emerged that's really going to be key to this is differing levels of coded language across different cultural contexts. So for example, in the US, white nationalist groups know that if they use really explicit slurs on mainstream platforms, their accounts will be flagged or their posts will be taken down relatively quickly these days. The platforms talk a lot about how they're capturing, 90% of hate speech on a given day or whatever the most recent numbers are. So these groups are then increasingly creative in how to use coded appeals and dog whistles to try to get the same messages across without being removed from the platforms. Whereas by contrast, I do a lot of work in the Arab world, and the use of explicit slurs, even by political leaders, mainstream religious leaders with huge followings, is a lot more common. And so identifying hate speech in those environments is often a bit easier. But again, as soon as content moderation catches up with the spread of hateful speech, actors adapt adapt to avoid detection. And so I think this again just speaks to the need for more cumulative knowledge generation that is trying to avoid these temporal validity problems by continuing to monitor the same spaces over longer time horizons.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. I think that it's now time for a break. Kelly, did you have any announcements, or are we good to go?
No, my only announcement is that I am delighted that we are actually on time. It's a minor miracle. We're going to take 10 minutes and we'll be back at 10:30 to hear from Sam Woolley on computational bots, which I think, Steve, you'll be moderating too. So thanks all. We'll be back in 10. Great, thanks all. So we are ready to go ahead and get started again. If Zeev, you want to go ahead and take it from here.
Great, thanks, Kelly. So our next speaker today is going to be Sam Woolley. He's an assistant professor in the School of Journalism at the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas, Austin, and a Knight Faculty Fellow and the Program Director of Propaganda Research at the Center for Media Engagement at UT. Before he begins, I just want to remind folks on the call to drop questions into the Q&A box. I'll be moderating that box, and then for any unanswered questions, hopefully Sam will be able to reply to everyone individually. Sam, take it away.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. I'm going to go without slides today since it's kind of a shorter talk. I want to discuss computational propaganda and bots and sort of where we've made progress and where we still need to do work. When we talk about computational propaganda, there's sort of a plethora of definitional challenges and ways of speaking about this topic. Most simply, the ways that my colleagues and I have defined computational propaganda has been the use of automation and algorithms over social media in attempts to manipulate public opinion. In practice, what this has generally meant has been focusing upon how bots, so automated, specifically social bots, automated accounts on social media, get used to either amplify particular streams of information or suppress particular streams of information. But today what I want to do is kind of, issue a broader sort of challenge or provocation, which is to say, like, we focus a lot on how bots have been used, say, over Twitter or over YouTube and other social media platforms in attempts to manipulate public opinion. But what we haven't done as much is look into the variety of other things that fall under the banners of automation and algorithmic manipulation. So while it's interesting how bots get used over Twitter to create the illusion of, say, popularity for a particular political candidate or a particular idea, or the illusion of dissent or anger towards opposition members or minority groups, there's also a lot of other variables here at play. And so I think that it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that increasingly, because of successes, in fact, in social media self-regulation, i.e. preventing broader scale use of bots, there has been now a movement towards the use of semi-automated profiles a lot of the time, or human-based profiles in spreading propaganda and spreading disinformation. And so it's not just about how bots themselves are amplifying or suppressing content on the front end of platforms as well. We also need to be talking about how bots, but also things like sock puppets and a few other mechanisms that I'm going to talk about in just a second, are being used to influence stuff on the back end. So how is communication between, say, bots or sock puppet accounts influencing trending content or recommendations about like what news articles people get to read, and even, for instance, media reporting. So we all know that journalists are now under tight crunches to report, and they oftentimes use social media data in their reporting. Folks like Joe Luquito, now a fellow faculty member here at UT, have studied the ways in which actually the media sometimes re-reports on trends or upon content that has been seeded and fertilized by bots or by sock puppets. So in the last, say, year or two, my own research has spread from thinking about bots and Twitter towards thinking about sock puppets, something that I call partisan nano influencers. So regular people that are paid a little bit of money to spread particular kinds of political content, and other actor groups being used over all social media, not just Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, but also a wide variety of encrypted chat applications, increasingly virtual reality social media, and importantly, discussing how these kinds of actor groups are actually built in such a way that they are evading social media monitoring tools that have been built to, for instance, specifically capture and get rid of bot-driven content. So I mentioned partisan nano-influencers. This is kind of a new phenomena. I recently wrote an op-ed in Wired about this. During the 2020 election in the United States, what we're seeing is groups like Main Street One, which is more on the left, but also a number of other groups on the right and in between, working to pay people off platform to spread particular types of messaging on behalf of a particular political campaign or on behalf of a particular issue. So environmentalism, abortion, those sorts of things. And the big challenge that we face here, as you're probably all thinking, is, well, with bots, at least we could track, like, network signals, temporal signals, semantic signals. But with partisan nano influencers, these regular people who have like under 5,000 followers, it's really difficult to figure out whether or not they're actually spreading paid political content, especially if they're not self-reporting. And so policy-wise, internally for the social media companies, the ads dashboards that we now have to catalog political advertisements that show when someone's buying an official ad aren't really relevant in the era of the partisan nano influencer. And these have been created in direct response and to bots, and are also, or to bot detection, and are also oftentimes making use of bots in some of what they do. Another sort of challenge in this space that I see is that we need to rethink how we analyze and address propaganda and disinformation right now. Traditionally, especially in the era of broadcast media, our focus has been upon nation states as the primary actors that are promulgating propaganda and disinformation. This is changing. And I think that one provocation that I would issue is that we have to access some of the theory of the past. So whether it's the theory of like Jacques Ellul or you going as far back as Lippmann and Lazarsfeld, to think through the ways in which propaganda then, in the era of radio, television, film, has changed in the digital area towards more of a democratized format of propaganda, where anyone with a bit of knowledge about coding, and even some people without knowledge of coding who use platforms like If This Then That, can use bots and other tools to spread their own propaganda and their own disinformation. And so the playing field has been broadened. So in the same way that anyone can be a journalist online, or so it was said, anyone can also be a propagandist online. And that has serious implications for how we understand this stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of questions that remain about what social media companies can do. I think that there's been a lot of activity on the front of computational propaganda and bots specifically, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Specifically, as I alluded to earlier, we've got to do more work to figure out how trends and algorithmic recommendations are being gamed, and how this contributes to the larger phenomenon of what Benkler et al. Called network propaganda. So this idea that, it's not just like one particular propaganda campaign on social media that matters. It's the whole ecosystem of how propaganda gets circulated throughout the broader media. So Fox News, Breitbart, Huffington Post, Daily Caller, all these different sort of more partisan sites, as well as social media. And so social media is just sort of one part of the equation there. I also think it's important, and what I talk about in this chapter is how we can discuss the ways in which journalists are both the people on the front lines of computational propaganda and things like state-sponsored trolling, but also how unintentionally sometimes journalists reproduce or perpetuate propaganda. I don't know if you all saw the recent story of the 6 or so journalists that were paid unknowingly to spread Russian propaganda. Well, that's a very overt example, but there's also much less overt examples in which journalists unintentionally quoting specific tweets or quoting metrics on social media have in some way, shape, or form perpetuated these problems by re-reporting on data from social media that is flawed. Now, I'll end on some policy ideas. The age-old idea has always been, well, maybe we need to tag political or commercial bot accounts. It's not as easy as it seems. Maybe something that is better, or a little bit more easy to achieve, would be to limit the amount of posts particular types of accounts can make a day. So especially if they're political accounts, perhaps we limit them to, say, 20 posts a day. We are still, to this day, on Twitter, Facebook, all these other platforms, are seeing accounts that are posting thousands of times a day about a particular political topic or political topics. And that's a problem insofar as it affects both front-end communication, potentially through convincing people to believe one thing or another, but also through back-end communication with the algorithms themselves. We should note that ads are the tip of the iceberg when it comes to computational propaganda, because the function of bots, sock puppets, political nano-influencers is to drive disinformation and propaganda and other forms of manipulation through the mainstream portions of the site. So Facebook groups or Twitter. And so just the Twitter feed or through the YouTube comments section. And so we have to focus more on how we can curb the influence of these sorts of mechanisms, and there are these actor groups, if you will, when they involve human action, in the more general portions of the sites, and not lose focus by only looking at ads, because advertising, as we all know now, doesn't only occur through the traditional ads mechanism. It's actually occurring real time through these partisan nano influencers in a way that we couldn't have previously foreseen, perhaps. And then finally, it's really important that we understand that there already is some degree of criminal liability for attacking protected political groups online, and also for spreading disinformation about how and when and where to vote. We're still seeing that a lot. We just need to figure out a better way of tracking the people who are actually perpetrating those kinds of crimes and hold them accountable for what they're doing. And the last thing I'll say is that computational propaganda has become a business. And so if we really want to address the problem of computational propaganda, one of the things we have to do is hit people where it hurts, which is to say, like, make it unprofitable for people to use bots, to use sock puppets, and so therefore sort of take away some of the teeth. All right, that's about all I have in terms of comments, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. So actually, this was well timed. So the question that we have in the chat from Laura Bosek is actually about this last point. So her question is, you mentioned that nation states are not always the primary movers of propaganda. So who pays for these sort of partisan nano influencers? Or to put it another way, like, what are their incentives?
Yeah, so the who pays for it question is really important. And oftentimes it can be traditional political actor groups. So it could be things like political parties, campaigns, could even be militaries or intelligence services. But more often than not, it's actually commercial entities that are paying for these partisan nano influencers, or NGOs. In the US context, what we're seeing a lot of is super PACs or PACs paying for partisan nano influencers. And so sometimes, because of the distributed nature of digital political communication these days, the campaigns themselves, the political campaigns and the candidates don't actually even know. It's kind of like an emperor with no clothes situation. They don't know that a lot of the content that's being spread on their behalf is actually computational propaganda. It's actually coming from tangential supporters or others like that. There's also grassroots efforts, or maybe it would be more akin to AstroTurf efforts, to fund partisan nano influencers. We're seeing people who are particularly concerned with a given issue spreading a lot of this kind of content through various nano influencers. And specifically what I've seen is conversations around environmentalism, global warming, and using those issues to then speak to a broader political concern or a political campaign. So some of the time, and actually I would say more often, we've seen partisan nano influencers being used around particular political conversations and issues rather than particular candidates.
So a sort of follow-up to this from Tamar Burton is could labeling the type of content, example from a sock puppet account or sort of a partisan nano influencer, be a counter activity toward this practice? And I think a related question to that is, you mentioned making it unprofitable in order to be sort of a nano influencer. Specifically, how would you recommend doing that?
So so on the first question from Tamar, I would say that labeling content can be useful. Social media companies have long said that this is a big challenge for them to be able to label content, because the binary distinction between a person and a bot is not necessarily achievable. As I always say in my research, there's always a person behind the bot, and so bots are an extension of people. And when we get into the legal problems associated with this, we get into problems of free speech and curbing people's speech. Even though they're using a bot, and we might not think that's fair. So labeling is one way of doing things. I would say that it might be more useful because labeling can be subjective to, again, limit the amount of times that someone can post. And then Zeev, what was the second part of the question there?
The second part of the question related to what you said at the very end, which was about sort of shifting some of the financial incentives around being a nano influencer. And in particular, are there any policy recommendations around how to do that?
In terms of internal regulation at the social media firms, I think that that moves as simple as creating strict warnings for people, like basically saying, like, if you do this and we find out you're doing it, there will be repercussions. Could be one very passive policy measure, because a lot of the time when we're talking to these partisan nano influencers, they don't actually know that they're doing anything wrong. And so part of the job that we have here is generating more understanding amongst regular social media users, whether it's the local pastor or a school teacher who are being paid as partisan nano influencers, to understand that if they do this, they're actually breaking campaign finance laws in some way, shape, or form. The challenges, to be blunt, I think the challenges for tracking and creating policies for tracking partisan nano influence are major, because these people are being paid off platform. And so, in response to the Wired article, some people asked me, what can we do as platforms to respond to this when people are being paid off platform? Well, my response to that is that people have been being paid off platform for commercial purposes for a very long time to do exactly this kind of influencing. And so I think the same infrastructures that you use there to prevent violations of, say, of a more commercial kind could be extended to the political sphere.
So I'm going to use the time-honored tradition of asking two impossibly difficult questions when you have about 3 minutes left. One is from Nate personally, and that is, what is the best example of large impact from bots, either on public attitudes or behavior? And the second is from Will Duffield. And he asks, sort of, convincing people to believe one thing or another is also how democracy is intended to work. So where do you draw the line between political communication and propaganda? I've also asked that question in a different way, which is to say that coordinated inauthentic behavior is a really apt sort of definition for political campaigns. So where do we draw the lines between just democratic politics and propaganda?
Great question. So on Nate's question, in terms of generating understandings of impact, there's lots of studies that have been out there that have experimentally studied the ways in which bots can impact people's behavior and what they share and when. I think that, a discussion, I'm a qualitative researcher, so let me say that first of all. I think a discussion of behavioral impact of bots and computational propaganda has become sort of this straw man for a lot of people in this field, like kind of trying to say that, we need to be able to determine what the impact is at the voting booth. When, someone like Jacques Ellul and people in the sociological tradition would say that the very minute that you begin trying to put this into a vacuum and studying propaganda or the usage of, bots, for instance, in this circumstance, through experimentation, you take it out of the sociological context in which it's successful. This is a sociological phenomenon. It's something that's really broad. It's not just the bots themselves having an effect upon a person in a direct way, like we might conceive it in political science, but it's actually like more along the lines of what Benkler et al. Have said, which is like this network propaganda effect, wherein the media is actually re-reporting on that, and it's much more difficult to track. And so if you want to look to people that have actually been able to demonstrate those kinds of effects, you can look to Joe Lucchito's research, in which he's been able to demonstrate that elite media figures and elite politicians have actually picked up computational propaganda and respread it to their constituents, and therefore creating like more of a focus on secondary effects rather than primary effects, because I think a focus on primary effects kind of gets us into this mire where, we're in a chicken and egg situation. The second question is, what's the difference between political communication and propaganda writ large? I think that in the social media era, there's a few key things that make computational propaganda different from political communication. One is anonymity. So the use of anonymity for the sake of manipulating public opinion, I would venture to say is more problematic than, say, front-end transparent political communication from a political campaign. If we know who it's coming from, then I would say it's more akin to political communication. If we don't know who it's coming from, then I would call it more computational propaganda. But I'm also of the belief that propaganda in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's kind of like, in the eye of the beholder, who's producing it and for what purposes. And so that's a complicated question and a complicated discussion to have. There's a lot of people out there these days trying to put weight behind what are the good kinds of computational propaganda and what are the bad kinds. How can we fight back? And I don't really have the answers to that. I think that it's a big challenge, and it's not going to be answered by any one researcher. I would say that transparency matters, the ways in which you use automation, the ways in which you use anonymity matter, and also the purposes for which you're using it. So if you're attacking protected groups, there's a clear line that needs to be drawn there. If you are misinforming the public on how to vote, there's a clear line that needs to be drawn there. But by and large, I see computational propaganda again as a sociological phenomenon. I don't see it as good, bad, or in between. I think it's just more broadly like something that's happening that we need to generate better understandings of.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. So we're out of time, but there are a number of really fantastic questions in the Q&A box. If you're able to stick around, you can respond to them sort of directly there. I'm now going to pass things over to Nate, who will introduce and moderate the next few speakers. Nate.
Thank you. I believe we've got Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen up next. Is that right? There he is, joining us. I would say relatively late at night, at least compared to many of us over at Oxford. And he's going to talk about his chapter on the changing media environment. Turn it over to you, Rasmus.
Great. Thanks very much to you and Josh for putting together the book, and to Kelly and everyone else, and Michelle and everyone else involved in organizing this webinar. So I'm going to speak about the main arguments that Richard Fletcher and I make in a chapter we call Democratic Creative Destruction, ? The implications of a changing media environment for our democracies. If you're interested in some of the underlying data and research, I'll point you to my Twitter profile, where I've tweeted slides and links for those who are interested in more details. But just briefly, in terms of what the argument we lay out in the chapter is, we appropriate the term democratic creative destruction from Joseph Schumpeter, a political economist from Austria who wrote about the impact essentially of capitalism on modern societies. I think there are some, perhaps particularly in the technology industry, who sometimes romanticize this in a as a benign force, if you will, or at least benign for some. And we would use it more, if you will, as an analytical tool to think about the way in which some internal dynamics in a contemporary and increasingly digital economy is destroying or damaging old institutions, even as new ones arise, in a way that have consequences for our democracies, both at the institutional level and at the individual level, and consequences that are often largely unintended or collateral to developments that really primarily often are about business, if you will, and the choices that each of us make as individual media users. And what we focus on in the chapter really is the case of news media and the role that news media play as what Tim Cook has called an informal political institution. You won't find in the Constitution, it has no formal political role. But in a democracy, news media have become integral to the process of government, as well as to the connection between elected officials and us as individual citizens. And I suppose the key argument we make in the chapter really is that, obviously with variation from country to country, because while the move to a digital, mobile, and increasingly platform-dominated media environment is largely a global, the way it plays out is contingent on national context and differences from country to country. But large scale, the argument we lay out is at the institutional level, the news media that we have many reasons to have reservations about. We know that historically journalism in many countries has primarily been about white men, for white men, and by white men, and the way it's covered many important issues that I think in retrospect we would often say today are regrettable, but we also think are important, and we have copious amounts of research to suggest that people who pay attention to independent, professionally reported journalism from news media know more about politics. They're more active in the political process, and they're often more connected with their communities. And what we're arguing in the chapter really is that the institutional impact of the move to a more digital, mobile, and platform-dominated media environment is an existential threat, really, to the business models that funded independent professional journalism in many countries historically, whereby an entirely sort of accidental meeting between the interests of advertisers and the dynamics of mass media, advertising essentially generated large amounts of resources for journalism, but increasingly, of course, that advertising is following us as we go online, and online, the bulk of that advertising goes to a few large technology companies such as Facebook and Google, who are hovering up resources that historically often, in part, funded journalism when they went to newspapers, for example. And this, of course, has direct consequences on newsroom employment and thus the ability of news organizations to cover the news and inform citizens. Now, I think the platforms have sort of accelerated this development, but we need to recognize, of course, that much of this development sort of predates the emergence of dominant companies such as Facebook and Google. In America, for example, per capita paid circulation of newspapers has been in nonstop decline since after the Second World War, and the share of advertising that went to newspapers too has been in nonstop decline for more than half a century. So much of this was ongoing, if you will, and it's been accelerated by the emergence of these very powerful large companies. Now, in addition to their sort of institutional impact on the existing news media, of course, the platforms has also enabled everyone in very unequal ways to raise their voice in ways that sort of realize the cliche that every organization is a media organization. So, of course, you see politicians and parties and interest groups and NGOs and activists, as well as misinformation peddlers of various sorts, embrace the same technologies that are also disrupting the business of journalism. Now, if we turn from the institutional level to the individual one, what does this mean for us as citizens? I mean, what we see overall is in almost every country we have data on is that people have embraced not just digital media, but also have embraced various forms of platforms as their main way of accessing online news. Social, search, sometimes aggregators. In many countries, more people name these as their main way of accessing online news than access it by going direct to news sites and news apps. Now, there are many sort of problematic aspects of this: data collection, the ways in which these systems sort of generate advertising revenues, and the different kinds of harassment and abuse that they also enable. But I think it's important to sort of recognize that this development is often driven by individual aggregate choices that people make who prefer these, it seems. It's not that we can't use print newspapers or broadcasters, it's that we choose not to. And that the consequences also in part drive incidental exposure to more and more diverse sources of news than most people seek out of their own volition on the internet. So I think we see it's quite an ambiguous development in terms of the individual implication. We have access to more information. There's often increased information inequality as the most interested seek out more and more, but most others are finding entertainment more compelling. But we also see this ambiguous role of the platforms that simultaneously, as they disrupt the business of news, are also driving news discovery in ways that often increase, however marginally, the diversity and range of views that some are exposed to. So in conclusion, really what we sort of conclude in the chapter is that if we take these sort of two trends at the institutional and individual level and look towards the future, what can we imagine might happen? I mean, largely we would say that what we're seeing is sort of a weakening of the inherited formal and informal institutions of democracy, the sort of kratos part of democracy, but often at the same time in a way that strengthens the demos, the sort of popular demotic component of democracy, even as it also makes a few large companies very powerful and very profitable. If we look at news specifically, what we might imagine in the future, I think sort of 4 different scenarios we outline in the chapter. One is what we call restoration. So you can imagine a world in which it just might be possible to reestablish some form of the business model that made private for-profit news publishing quite profitable in many countries for a long period of time. I think this is extremely unlikely, but it's not impossible. And it's clear that there are some who are quite fond, if you will, of this sort of imagery of sort of the 1990s just with digital. Now, there is also a different way of thinking about this, which is about renewal, if you will, not about a restoration to the sort of the the pre-digital role of the press and the news media, but about what is the role of news media in a fundamentally transformed digital environment, where the role will be very different also for democracy and for us as citizens, but still be an important role, even if it's not the same played in the 20th century. Then I think there is a scenario that we call retreat, which is effectively a situation where news media retreat to serving exclusively a small minority of elite audiences who are willing to pay, often quite partisan, often quite privileged, and effectively end up playing a role that may still be important in elite policy and politics processes, but is effectively almost irrelevant when it comes to the mass public. So a role that is sort of, if I may be unkind, sort of a bit more similar to high culture, opera and the like, which is sort of important for some people, but not really a mass phenomenon. And finally, of course, I think there is the much darker scenario, what we call relegation, where we can imagine that the bulk of the news industry becomes relegated to being instruments of powerful political and corporate interests who use them to defend their interest or advance their ideologies in ways that have nothing in common really with the ideals of independent news media and professional journalism. And I think we need to remember that this really is arguably is the historical median outcome, actually, and in much of the world, sadly, is the state of much of the news media. Now, this development will be influenced by our choices as users and the choices that journalists and news media make. But of course, there is also a policy dimension to this. And I would end then finally with a single observation, which is that if we look at sort of the revealed preferences of policymakers, including in democracies who have a strong tradition of free media, what we are seeing right now, I would say effectively is sort of deliberate non-intervention and negative policy. There are demonstrated good practices available if elected officials should wish to create a more enabling environment for professional journalism and independent news media. But in most countries across the world, including almost all liberal democracies, we're not seeing any political consensus about implementing any of these measures. And if anything, we're seeing a combination of policy drift, where 20th century policies are still meant to regulate a 21st century media environment, and often actually an erosion of forms of support and protection that were meant to enable professional journalism, but no longer really command widespread and strong political support at the elite level, and perhaps not even at the level of the mass public.
Thank you, Rasmus. I want to pick up right where you left off, which is about what you said were, I think, the sort of available interventions to policymakers that they sort of deliberately haven't chosen. What are some of those things that they could do to sort of buttress the traditional press, or for that matter, even the new journalists that they're not doing?
I mean, the way I think about this, and this is based on work done with Robert Gorba, who was also on this call later today, and Madeleine de Kock-Breuning, who was then at the University of Utrecht, I think there's sort of three things that enable professional journalism and independent news media. You need freedom, you need funding, and then you need a sort of a commitment to a role of journalism in the future that will increasingly be about digital media and various forms of automation and autonomous systems. In the area of freedom, I think it's very clear that there is a war being waged on journalism in many parts of the world, including some democratic countries, by some politicians who see news media as the enemies of the people and try to weaponize sort of hostile sentiment towards them for their own purposes. And this is sort of compounded by a glaring implementation gap, including in many democracies, where states will sign up to various conventions, the Council of Europe recommendations or others, about what they're supposed to do to protect the role of professional journalism and independent news media in their societies, and then they do nothing about it, nothing at all. They sign a piece of paper and do nothing. So freedom is sort of a starting point, if you will. Without that, the rest doesn't make much sense. Money alone is not going to cut it. In the funding area, I would point really sort of three main forms of intervention that have sort of proof of concept. The model of public service media, known from sort of Northwestern Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia and Canada, it has limitations and drawbacks and imperfections, and there is a concern over market impact and the question of crowding out, though it's poorly supported by the evidence. But it also has very demonstrable, measurable, positive impact on the equality of information levels in the mass public, as well as how much people generally know about politics. That's another meaningful intervention. Secondly, you have a number of countries, mostly in Northwestern Europe, where very significant forms of indirect and direct public subsidies are made available to independent for-profit private publishers to incentivize them to invest in professional journalism. Again, these systems exist, they are possible, they make a measurable difference. It's a choice whether we do it or not. And finally, of course, and here is a rare instance where I think we can say the United States, is something that other countries could look at as an example of good practice. There are rules and regulations around how you register a nonprofit news organization and whether you can get tax deductions and the like for philanthropic support and individual donations to support nonprofit journalism. In many countries, these rules don't exist. It's exceedingly hard to register a nonprofit news organization, and there is no tax incentive for individuals or others to support it in a philanthropic way. So of course, these are tools that are available, and it's a question of political will and implementation, whether democracies decide that the journalism that mattered in the past is also going to matter in the future.
You mentioned among your list earlier Australia. Australia lately has flexed its muscle against the platforms in trying to distribute profits in some ways that the platforms have been exacting on Australian news organizations. What do you think about what they did, as well as the platform's response to it? And is this a signal of what should be done or should be avoided going forward?
I think it's important just here to be completely clear that the Reuters Institute that I direct, we take funding from a number of different sources, including news organizations, regulators, foundations, and the like, but we also have two large grants, one from Facebook and one from Google. So I think people should know that when I speak to this topic. My role, I think, as a sort of an expert and an analyst is not really to sort of prescribe specific policies to policymakers. I think this is a question for elected officials and for citizens to make decisions about how they want to allocate resources and what collectively binding decisions they think on balance are the ones that they want for their society. I can try to help sort of reason through what the implications might be of different sources, sort of choices. I suppose my personal view as a citizen is that I think it's very clear that there is a very real risk of market failure in many areas of journalism, particularly local journalism and journalism that focus on less privileged parts of society. I think the role that journalism at its best has demonstrably played in our societies historically would, in my personal view as a citizen, merit a public intervention to support and enable it. I think the funding of that could very reasonably involve, looking more closely at taxations that I think as an individual citizen, I often find it extremely difficult to understand how little large companies such as Facebook and Google pay in tax in overseas jurisdictions where they generate very, very significant revenues, including here in the UK. And I'm very glad personally that the UK government is looking at digital services tax and the European Union is looking at the union level as well. I say all that to lead up to say that means I think there are other options that are on the table, more aggressive taxation of large profitable companies, and thinking about the policies that already exist that I think have sort of proof of concept and already work in other countries. The sort of what we see in Australia and France is, I think, laudable in the sense that I'm glad that policymakers are willing to take action to support independent professional journalism. I have reservations about whether a political intervention to decide the price point of relations between sort of different corporations is sort of a particularly efficient way of doing this. And I do also have reservations about whether we risk ending up in a situation in which publishers, to benefit from such interventions, have to be on platforms that they also want to cover critically because they're powerful institutions and may have reservations about being part of because of their data collection practices or other problems that they think are associated with them. And where the benefits then of having to be on platforms is dictated by politicians that the publishers also want to cover, right? So I have some reservations about the details of this, but I'm looking forward to seeing what the final rules and regulations will be in Australia and France. And as said, I'm very sympathetic to some of the motivations behind them, though I do wonder whether there are other policy tools that might achieve those goals in a way that were more efficient and less sort of had fewer sort of risks associated with them. And I would include the funding of that, I think, from a personal point of view, should also include looking more closely at how much tax companies like Facebook and Google pay.
Wonderful. I think we've run out of time, but Josh has put in the chat your Twitter handle, and so people can see the slides that relate to this presentation, and also feel free to answer some of the additional questions we couldn't get to that are in the Q&A. And I think now we turn to Travis to talk about political advertising.
All right. Well, thank you, Nate. I'm going to share my screen here. Event sharing options. Let's see. Yes, there. All right, so I'm going to talk about my book chapter with Erica Franklin Fowler and Michael Franz called Online Political Advertising in the United States. And I suspect everyone would agree that this is an important topic, but I want to bring some data to bear here to try to make that case. This figure is showing you digital share of political ad spending over the past, I guess, 6 election cycles. It was about 0 in 2010, up to 14% in 2016, 20% in 2018, and early estimates that I could find suggest that it is going to be about 27% of political ad spending in our current election cycle. So obviously something important to study. And so our chapter really takes an encompassing view, kind of everything we know about digital political advertising, at least at the point we wrote the chapter, because there's so much new information coming out each day. And so we start by looking at kind of the campaign finance landscape, the rules that govern political advertising. And our last major campaign finance legislation in the US, BICRA in 2002, did not include specific coverage of online political activity. And so as online advertising became more popular, the Federal Election Commission in 2006 exempted almost all pro or anti-candidate activity online from the definition of expenditures or contributions. So if I, as a citizen, put up a website that mentioned a candidate's name, I wouldn't have to report that as a contribution to the FEC. Now, the one exception here was communications placed for a fee on another person's website, which were reportable. However, there was a loophole in this. The BICRA requirement that electioneering communications featuring a candidate within 60 days of a general, 30 days of a primary, that did not extend to those online communications. So there are still groups out there that are not required to report their spending on online advertising. And so in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential campaign, the Honest Ads Act was proposed in Congress, but never passed. Still, there was a lot of congressional scrutiny in this area. And so the platforms, at least the major platforms, Facebook, Google, Twitter at the time, created their own ad libraries to provide some transparency about spending and content of political advertising online. But this also meant that the tech firms were creating their own rules. And there was variation in these rules across the various platforms. There was variation in the application of these rules across the platforms, across campaigns, across particular ads. And so in essence, we the people were giving the power to determine what is political and what needs to be transparent to the tech firms themselves. And so how are digital ads purchased? Well, there are 3 primary methods here. One is a direct buy with a website, with a newspaper, online newspaper, or with a social media company. There are also intermediary ad networks, which do brokering of space through sellers who aggregate the inventory. And then programmatic purchasing. You may have heard of the ad exchanges, where campaigns are bidding for ad space in real time. But the upshot of all of this, of course, is that there is no central clearinghouse for digital inventory. There's no central clearinghouse where we can find information about digital advertising. And so what about targeting? We know one of the chief advantages of online advertising is the ability to target messages, but we actually don't know all that much about how that takes place. One reason for that is the information that the platforms provide on the targeting categories tends to be very broad. Maybe it's a large age group, for instance, or a certain state. There's also some inconsistency in the information provided. So Google, for instance, shows the audience that the advertiser sought, while Facebook shows the audience that the advertiser actually received, and there may be a big difference between those two. So how do we measure digital spending? Well, one way is through those FEC campaign committee filings. But again, there are issues with inconsistent categorization. It may just be a big purchase to one media buying firm, and that's all that's reported. It's also not comprehensive. As I talked about, there are some groups that are not required to report their spending. So others rely upon tracking firms. They may use ad crawlers that search the internet for political ads, or a panel-based approach in which individuals agree to allow their their web browsing to be tracked. Of course, this information is not public information. You have to pay a lot of money to get this information. And then, of course, there are the platform libraries. Google and Facebook being the most prominent. But again, there are issues of comparability across the two. There's no local spending in Google. At one point, they didn't provide spending on state elections. They also provide ranges of spending, not actual spending on a particular ad, though they do provide aggregates for particular advertisers. So finally, what do we know about digital ad content? We do know a few things, especially in comparison to TV ads. For one, the goals are more varied than TV ads. Digital ads are mobilizing, they're raising money, they're acquisition of email addresses, and so on, in addition to persuasion. Digital ads are tend to be less issue focused than TV ads. Digital ads also tend to be less negative than political ads, perhaps because of the variety of goals that they pursue. Finally, digital ads tend to be more partisan in their language. They address more partisan issues that divide the political parties. And perhaps that is a function of their ability to be targeted. And so in the end, what do we need to do to improve data on digital advertising for those of us who study this? First, we just need more comprehensive data. We need to close that digital communication loophole. And we need data on platforms and websites beyond Facebook and Google. Yes, these are the biggest players in the game, but there's a lot of third-party advertising that we just know nothing about. All elections need to be included, not just federal or state elections. We also need more consistency. The definition of political, I would hope, could be made consistent across various ad libraries, for instance. And we also need more detail on that targeting data. Who is being targeted beyond just people in Ohio? What specific types of voter groups are they trying to contact? And so I will stop sharing my screen, and I would be happy to take any questions at this point.
Travis, let me just start with the kind of meta question on political advertising, which is, look, you and others have always pointed to the minimal effects that political advertising, even before the internet revolution, have had on attitudes and the like. Do we have a sense that online advertising is either, particularly valuable in campaigns, or is it the same in terms of its effect as other kinds of advertising?
There are people who say, yes, it's more valuable because you're targeting your message to individuals who might be most receptive to that message, right? And that should increase its influence. Other people say, actually, the ads that people confront online are oftentimes delivered in a format that is not as conducive to persuasion as is a TV ad. You know, TV ad, that's a video experience. You want to finish watching the TV program you're watching. The audio is probably on. Where a lot of online advertising, it's very easy to skip. I think the real effectiveness of online advertising is some things are measurable. You know, we can measure how much money you raise as a result of a particular ad, or how many email addresses you generate because of a particular ad. And so that's where I think campaigns find it valuable. They're still kind of up in the air on how much persuasion they actually get out of this, though.
What about with respect to, say, demobilization or mobilization? So that, look, one of the accusations that was hurled on the 2016 ads, both from the Russian-focused ads as well as those, that were criticisms lodged at the Trump campaign, were that the ads that were run were successful in demobilizing electorates and like. Is there any evidence for that you've seen?
I've not seen any evidence for that. Given the scale of those particular ad campaigns, I would find it hard to believe that they had much of an impact in terms of mobilizing or demobilizing. But if it were a multi-million-dollar ad campaign run by a presidential candidate, for instance, that was pursuing those particular goals, I would find that more plausible.
What about, we do have some questions on micro-targeting. And so you said that one of the things that would make online advertising valuable is the fact that you can do, selective micro-targeting. There's also been sort of legislation that's been introduced to try to get at micro-targeting. Micro-targeting is not new to the online environment, whether it's robocalls or direct mail and the like. Is there a sense, I asked you before about how valuable online advertising is. And it seems to me that the micro-targeting plus perhaps the some theory about how especially manipulative online communication will be is sort of the way to distinguish online ads from, say, television or sort of broader based targeting. What do we know anything about micro-targeting at this point, and the extent to which that is providing selective benefits to the candidates that are using it? I suppose it could be in the area of email addresses and fundraising that you were saying before, but is there anything either on the persuasion, mobilization, demobilization side?
There's not a lot of definitive research that has been able to answer this question. I find it interesting with the Trump campaign. Their initial online efforts, on which they were spending multiple millions, was very broad in scope, just trying to identify those individuals who might like Trump enough or be interested in his message enough to click a particular ad, right? And they had to spend a lot of money in order to generate that list that they're now trying to get the benefits from. Based on the latest reporting, it sounds like, they maybe weren't making too much money off of it, but ultimately they made more money than they spent.
Do you have any idea of what would be if you had to point to an example of the most influential online ad or campaign, what you could point to? Is there any sort of that comes to mind?
It's hard to think of a specific one, but in general, I think an online campaign that generates a lot of media coverage, that amplifies that particular message, that's the one that's going to be most effective.
Apropos that, as you may have seen, Facebook has now issued rules for the last week of the campaign so that they will not allow for new political advertisements to be run in the last week of the campaign, although they will allow the repurposing and retargeting and amplification of existing advertisements that were on the platform more than 7 days before the end of the election. What should we think of that kind of reform? Do you have any, based on the research that you've done, do you have a sense of the impact of something like that? or the smartness of it?
Yeah, I do think it's a way to try to prevent the spread of misinformation, right? It gives Facebook a bit of a breather to catch things. It gives the news media a bit of a chance to correct that misinformation that may be out there. I think the downside is when the big political event happens, 3 days before the election, or the president tweets something that goes viral, it doesn't necessarily give anyone else a chance to respond because they can't create a new ad to respond to a particular allegation.
Well, apropos that, when I asked you about what might be the best examples of the impact of political advertising, one argument is often made that online political advertising, because it can be done cheaply as compared to, say, television, is a sort of megaphone for the little guy, right? So that incumbents, whether they're the president or just someone who has natural capacity to access social media, they're in a different position than the unfunded challenger, and that social media rectifies that balance. Is there any evidence for that?
I think there's anecdotal evidence. I think about my state, Washington State, our Public Disclosure Commission and Attorney General have been in a bit of a battle with Facebook and Google for not complying with some state regulations. And so, in essence, those platforms have said, we're not going to sell ads for state or local candidates in this state. And I've talked to some of those candidates for local offices who've said, this makes things really tough for us. It used to be a lot easier. We could just target those individuals who live around us, get our name out there. It's harder now. So I guess I have anecdotal evidence that speaks to that.
One thing you mentioned was how difficult it is to define what is political and how we need to have a consistent definition across platforms and maybe in law. All right, so let me put you on the spot here. So if you could wave your wand, how should they define political on the platform level or legally? What is it that you want them to include that they're not, or exclude that is already included?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. I think, candidate names definitely has to enter into the equation. Facebook does something like, I forget their exact phrasing, but issues of public importance. I think the hard part is determining what are those issues of public importance in a particular year? Who decides? How broad must that be? And so great question. I'm not going to be able to answer it right now. I know that much.
Last question that we have in the chat is, how big a deal do you think political advertising is in the debate over misinformation and disinformation? If you had to sort of characterize, the contribution that political advertising is making to this problem of disinformation, how big a deal is advertising, let's say, as compared to organic content?
I think advertising is much less of a problem than the organic content. I think most political campaigns in the US, just as they do with TV ads, try to stay, fairly close to true information. You'd have to devote a lot of money to spread it around. Now, I'm not saying campaigns don't have a lot of money to do that, but then it becomes more visible, and then the media are calling you out on it. And so I think the organic content is where we see more of that spread of misinformation.
All right, well, thank you so much, and feel free to answer some more of the questions in the chat. I think I'm turning this now over to Kelly Bourne.
Yes, you are. Thanks, Nate. And I am going to turn it over to a break. So we'll have our last 10-minute break, and then we will return to discuss our final 3 chapters and then a Q&A with the co-editors. So we'll see you all in 10 minutes. Thanks. Great, welcome back everyone. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our last 3 chapters. And we'll begin with Frank Fukuyama, who is a professor here at Stanford University, and Andy Grotto, who is also a professor with us. They are both part of the Cyber Policy Center. Andy running our program on geopolitics, technology, and governance, and Frank working on our program, the Democracy and the Internet, which Nate is also a part of. They're going to discuss their chapter on comparative media regulation in Europe and the US, looking in particular at France and Germany and comparing how these countries versus the United States have regulated traditional media, print, radio, and TV, and how the philosophies underpinning each country's regulation of those mediums have really translated into what we are seeing in terms of their attempts to govern online information environments. And they conclude also with an exploration of different options between content moderation if we presume that we are stuck with large monopolies in this space, or antitrust if we think we might be able to break the platforms up. So Andy, I think I'll turn it over to you first, and then Frank will come to you in a moment. And then in the meantime, if folks can just enter any questions they have in the chat box, I will do my best to moderate those. Thank you both.
Great, thanks Kelly. Hello everyone. I want to start by just giving a quick shout out and thanks to Nate and Josh for for their leadership in pulling this volume together. It's really a tremendous contribution. I'm thrilled to have been a part of it. So long before liberal democracies worried about social media and democracy, they worried about media and democracy. And in particular, they worried about how a concentration of market power in a limited number of print and later broadcast media could result in a concentration of political power among a select few. And so the idea of a competitive news marketplace has loomed large as a presumed bulwark against authoritarianism. And so media policy in liberal democracies has therefore emphasized measures aimed at promoting competition, such as various subsidies aimed at supporting the multiplicity of media outlets, subsidies aimed at ensuring citizen access to diverse content, the creation of public broadcasting, and content requirements imposed on broadcast media through the licensing of spectrum. But there are also important differences among liberal democracies and their media regulatory traditions, and in particular, the extent to which the state should go beyond promoting competition to intervening more directly in content decisions. For states with a history of authoritarianism, such as Germany, state intervention in content decisions, as opposed to the more passive role of promoting competition, is itself viewed as presenting a risk of authoritarianism. And in the case of Germany, as we describe in our chapter, the government has largely tried to avoid direct intervention in media outlets' content decisions, aside from limited categories such as Nazi content, and has instead relied on competition, promoting competition, and then self-policing among media organizations. One of the main points in our chapter, therefore, is that as regulators examine the impact of social media on democracy, they bring decades or even centuries of prior experience or baggage, depending on your perspective, from their efforts to regulate legacy media. Germany's famous Facebook law, or NetzDG, which puts social media companies on the hook for moderating problematic content, illustrates how Germany's historical antipathy towards state-directed content moderation. We contrast this with France, which has always had a more statist approach to media, an approach on display in its decision to create a specialized judicial procedure for content moderation. I'll now turn to Frank, who will focus in particular on legacy regulation of broadcast television and how it sets precedents and shows the limitations of present day platform regulatory approaches. Frank, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks again to the editors. I really hate editing collected volumes, and you did a really great job. So I'm focusing actually on the United States. And the question is, given our First Amendment traditions, is it even possible to do content regulation, government content regulation? And here, I think looking back at legacy media is very helpful because there actually is a precedent for the kind of situation we face with these big internet platforms like Google and Facebook, not like Google and Facebook, Google and Facebook. And that's the situation of broadcast television in the 1950s and 60s, when you had a very small oligopoly of three network broadcasters that really dominated news coverage. And one question is, does the government actually have the power to limit or direct the kind of content that they provide? And I think from that earlier precedent, the answer is yes. There's a long history that is given in the chapter about this. There is a provision in the Communications Act of 1934 that established the FCC, that the FCC looks not just at the commercial welfare of broadcast media, but also at public interest. And that public interest provision evolved into something that was called the Fairness Doctrine, in which the FCC as an agency mandated that coverage of political events would have to be fair and balanced. And this came to before the Supreme Court because it was challenged as unconstitutional under the First Amendment. But in a 1968 case, the Red Line versus FCC case, it's funny, it had a lot of resonances for the present. It was a very conservative Christian broadcaster that was spewing conspiracy stories about the CIA and the FBI, and the FCC wanted to force them to accept a response to some of the people that it had accused. And the Supreme Court upheld the ability of the FCC to do this on the grounds of spectrum scarcity. And so this was something that became very controversial. Republicans really did not like the Fairness Doctrine. They made big efforts over the next 20 years to rescind it, and eventually the FCC, through an administrative decision, not through a statute by Congress, finally got rid of it in 1987. And so I do think that earlier experience, illustrates the way that the U.S. government actually did intervene, in political media. But this is actually what led me to my current interest in antitrust, because the question then would be, could you imagine a kind of modern day fairness doctrine being overseen by an administrative agency that would force a kind of balanced political discourse? And if you think the country was polarized in 1987, it's nothing like what it is now. And I think that the cases in Europe that Andy talks about, where you have, for example, a public broadcaster that actually tells people what the public broadcaster thinks they need to know, is very paternalistic in that sense, is possible only because there's a high degree of political consensus in those countries, or social consensus and trust of institutions like ZDF or the BBC or the government in general. And that obviously is not the condition of the United States in the year 2020. And so that leads to, I think, a dead end as far as state regulation of media content. We've relied on basically political pressure for self-regulation, but there's another possibility, which is antitrust, because I think that actually content is not nearly as controversial if it is not dominated by these two very, very large platforms that really do ultimately have the power to sway things like democratic elections. If that power was exercised deliberately by somebody that had a clear political agenda, which I think is not the case at the present moment. And so that leads into another long discussion, which I won't get into here. We have an antitrust working group going as part of our program on democracy and the internet here at Stanford. We're going to report our conclusions there, but that is a big alternative to what I think is a dead end of state regulation, at least for the United States, not for Europe, but in this country. So with that, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Frank and Andy, really helpful. And I think you answered my first question, which is the fairness doctrine dead when it comes to the internet? I would love to just start with a question and then open it up to others if they want to include questions in the chat box. But I'm curious, I appreciated you adding, I think early in your chapter, this quote from Alan Ibrahimian, where he basically lays out that censoring the internet is like nailing Jello to a wall. And I think many of us who have looked at content moderation for a while have come to feel that way also. But when you think about issues around antitrust, would be curious to hear, I think there have been a number of debates about how it would impact the market economically versus how it would impact the market for information, and whether we can just hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about the particular problems that antitrust could solve when it comes to questions of democracy rather than the economy.
That's a long story. I think that in our deliberations on the antitrust issue, the underlying problem is concentrated economic power that potentially translates into political power. And I think that tentatively what our group has decided is that the economic abuses, which is really what existing antitrust law in the United States and in Europe is designed to combat, is useful in certain ways, but that's not the biggest harm that is potentially out there from these big platforms. That the real dangers and harms are all in the political arena. I'm a little bit unhappy with the current state of the discussion, where basically it's a matter of civil society groups pressuring these platforms to do the right thing in terms of taking down conspiracy theories and fake news and so forth, because that does not get at the underlying problem of power. That it's like having a loaded gun sitting there on the table, and at the moment the guy sitting opposite you is not picking up the gun and shooting you with it, but it could happen under in the future. And so I think unless you address the problem of that underlying power, you're not going to get at the political harm, which is ultimately the ability to do something like sway an election. So we have some ideas. I think that the structural remedies of just breaking up either Facebook or Google are really not going to work because of network externalities and the just enormous returns to scale that these platforms represent, or the large networks represent. So I think you're going to need other approaches.
Thank you. And one sort of follow-up on that, which is just thinking about, you mentioned these sort of networks, and that in many respects, the benefit of them is the fact that they are sort of almost natural monopolies. And so what do you see as potential alternative ways to breaking them up? I know that there was a conversation for a bit about data portability, but a number of challenges there. Anything you can elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this exploration that we've been on for the last few months has led to one dead end after another. So one solution to the problem, if you can't break up Facebook and Google, people have suggested data portability. There are lots of reasons why I don't think that's going to work, beginning with the fact that the kind of data that is the most useful to these big platforms is very heterogeneous. It's not easy to transport. It's not clear who owns the property rights to your interactions with the networks, and therefore it's just not clear whether it's technically feasible. So that's one problem. Another approach is using privacy law, which is something that GDPR in Europe attempts to do. So if you generate data selling books, you cannot take that same data about your consumers and sell diapers or Whole Foods. I think that one also doesn't work terribly well, because basically the cat's out of the bag with regard to a lot of that data, and I don't think you're ever going to contain it, and the legality of it is really also not established. We've actually been thinking about a technological solution, which is to create a middleware layer of competitive companies that would basically take over the function of filtering what an internet user sees on the platform, that could reflect different political points of view, and essentially take away the platform's ability to moderate its own content. And I think that's something that would be very difficult because it gets at the basic business model of both of those platforms. It's probably something that can't be done except by statute, but I think that's the direction that we're looking to go right now.
Thanks, Frank. That's really helpful to see how those conversations have evolved. And then I have a question, two related questions, actually. One from Aaron Goldzimmer, who's a former colleague. So nice to see you on here, Aaron. And then another from Laura Bosek that get specifically at a question that many of us have wrestled with for a while around, generally speaking, what might be some of the unintended consequences of breaking up the platforms. And then much more specifically, we have gone back and forth in the field around what is the problem that we're trying to solve. Are we trying to create a healthier information environment for sort of the masses, or are we trying to avoid echo chambers of sort of hyperpolarized groups spinning off? And so the concern that Aaron puts forth is, would antitrust not just break the platforms up into a bunch of smaller platforms that would be more sort of homogeneous, more polarized, more extreme? So would love to hear more on unintended consequences. And then,
well, yeah, so the last one is a very common criticism of trying to create more competition in the political news space. And I think that that's a real issue. Obviously, QAnon gets its start in these very strange, kind of marginal platforms on the periphery of the larger networks. But I just think that that's something we have to live with. I think that stuff really does not get to be dangerous until it migrates from these peripheral networks into the mainstream. And it usually happens when mainstream media picks up a conspiracy theory that's been generated out at the fringes. And so it really is the scale that has the potential to have a really big political effect. And I guess that I would much rather have a lot of, horrible stuff going on in very small platforms that no one's ever heard of, rather than, having the ability of these big platforms to amplify it themselves. If you don't think that's an issue, just think about a future in which Google or Facebook is acquired by, one of the Koch brothers, or well, actually, the remaining Koch brothers now turn fairly liberal. But let's say, a Murdoch, or some other, a Sinclair, or some other conservative that actually wants to use it to try to sway an election. And I think that's what I mean by the underlying power, that we cannot just rely on the good wishes and good intentions of the existing incumbents.
Well, Matt, I think Frank's point raises another dimension of the challenge here, which is that he said you see these campaigns migrating from social media to legacy media. And legacy media, the news profession itself is experiencing major change as digital platforms create new mechanisms for reporting and dissemination. And respected news outlets face immense competitive pressures to get scoops and be the first to break news, to be part of the Twitterverse. And this dynamic is one that malign actors exploit to spread disinformation and propaganda. Legacy media competes with prominent internet-based news organizations. They're unabashedly ideological and do not have the same sort of traditional firewall that you see in conventional news outlets between editorial and the newsroom. So I think to me this points to an urgent need for more research into how competitive dynamics in the legacy media world are shaping journalistic norms about how to cover, how to report responsibly in the digital age.
Great, thank you both. Well, this has been extremely helpful. And there are a couple of questions still in the Q&A. So if you have time to get to those, that would be much appreciated. And in the meantime, to keep us on time, I'm going to turn now to Robert Gora, who, along with his colleague Timothy Garton-Ash at the University of Oxford, has authored the chapter on democratic transparency in the platform society, which begins by exploring the history of transparency first in government and then the translation of those efforts towards transparency of corporations and the corporate social responsibility movement, and then looking at the application of these transparency principles to the internet and how that has played out. And then also explores the broader interests that society have expressed, or the hopes that digital technologies would enable greater transparency, not just for internet platforms, but for all sectors. And then concludes, I think, with a little bit of caution about whether transparency is in fact the panacea that some of us have hoped that it might be. So Robert, I will turn it over to you, and then please, everyone, as usual, just answer any questions in the Q&A. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kelly. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this is working. Can you see these slides all right? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful symposium. It's been such a fun few hours listening into this and listening to all these great presentations and getting a bit of a breakdown on all the different chapters. So kudos to Josh and Nate and everyone involved in putting this together. It's a really great collection. So I'm Robert Gorwa. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Politics at Oxford. I co-authored this chapter with a historian at Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, who some of you may know. And the kind of impetus for this chapter, as we kicked it off a couple of years ago, was just the huge amount of transparency-related policy developments that were happening in the kind of post-2016 techlash of sorts, as some have called it. And this was coming from kind of all corners. So in civil society, a group of major digital rights groups got together to put together the Santa Clara Principles on content moderation, asking for better transparency, more data, more notice, more numbers about how companies were conducting their content moderation. Academics were trying to create a kind of robust, reproducible mechanism for getting researchers access to data from companies so we can know more about how their products impact society. In industry, you know, it's crazy. 2018 in platform regulation time is really light years away, but it's unbelievable to think that only in 2018, at the beginning of 2018, some of these major companies for the first time started making their community standards, the rules basically of content moderation, the definitions of hate speech, violence, all these other areas public for the first time, and started publishing enforcement reports on how they were enforcing those rules. As kind of public awareness of political advertising, as an earlier presentation mentioned, grew, you know, the companies implemented self-regulatory ad archives. And similarly, at the same time, all in kind of 2018, the NetzDG, so the German network enforcement law that went into effect on the 1st of January 2018, was the first regulation passed by a government that actually mandated biannual transparency reports into how companies were staffing and enforcing their content rules. And a few months later, in the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, kind of similar transparency reporting mechanisms were instituted. And now with the discussion that's going on in the EU about the Digital Services Act, there's a huge amount of transparency efforts and transparency talk that is floating around with various kind of aims and targets, whether it be transparency to the public, transparency to regulators, transparency to researchers. So the goal of the chapter was to kind of think about that transparency critically as a form of platform regulation, give it a historical overview of transparency as a democratic good, as Kelly mentioned, and kind of try to trace the evolution of it as an idea from something that was targeted at governments to something that began increasingly being proposed as something that could be a check to corporate power. And the second thing we tried to do then was to bring together a literature review on the kind of theory and practice of corporate transparency. And I'll talk about that here, less so on the first point. If you're interested in that, please check out the chapter. It's available at that link. I'll also put it in the chat. And the third kind of thing which we tried to do, which was also, I think, the most difficult task, just given how fast this space moves and the publishing timeline that is inherent in any book, is trying to provide a kind of overview and analysis of as many of, if not all of the transparency initiatives that the major platforms were doing pre and post 2016, focused mainly on content. So one of the main things that we kind of get to when we're sorting through the wealth of literature and thinking on all these different facets of transparency as an idea, going back to Kant and Rousseau and other Enlightenment thinkers, to kind of a more contemporary idea of something that Archon Fung, the political scientist at Harvard, and others have called democratic transparency. So this kind of very meta macro idea of transparency as a public good. So information being available to citizens in a way that lets them protect their vital interests. And that could be vis-a-vis government power, or it could be vis-a-vis corporate power. So the idea is that you need to know as a person, as a consumer, as a citizen, what is in that product that you're buying, what is in the food you're buying, what is in the medication that you're using. But also at a slightly kind of more micro level, there's an increasing amount of scholarship in political science, in regulatory politics, in governance studies, looking at the importance of transparency as part of an evidence-based policy approach, which, especially in this space, we talk about as something being kind of normatively desirable and essential. And this is the idea that you need to understand a system to govern it. You need to know what's in the black box to really be able to design kind of effective policy to remedy some potential harms that black box might be causing. And even more specifically, we've seen in the last decade, a huge amount of work from academics, but also from civil society, looking specifically at the question of major user-generated content platforms. This idea that transparency is essential for people to know when their rights and freedoms are violated and to identify who should be responsible, which platform should be responsible, what happened. The challenge here is that when you look at the kind of track record of corporate transparency in practice across other corporate governance domains, so mainly in the environmental and sustainability literature, but also in finance and kind of other domains, meta-analyses and big kind of empirical literature reviews have shown that transparency is no panacea. So the effect of transparency are much less pronounced than the kind of popular wisdom would suggest. And we're not exactly sure why that is. So it remains unclear why some transparency initiatives manage to actually influence the behavior of powerful institutions while others do not. And of course, not all transparency regimes are equal. So if you kind of delve into this political science literature on regulation and governance, you could think about these different regimes, just like any other regulation, having varying levels of obligation, precision, and delegation. So obligation being the specific kind of asks, the specific things that are demanded in a transparency regime, precision being the specific kind of level of analysis, the nuance of the things that are being demanded in a transparency regime, and then the delegation, who actually implements it, right? Is it the actor that is the target of a transparency regulation actually implementing themselves, or is there some kind of third-party audit or oversight? And the other kind of thing here at play is that these differ in what is called in the literature vertical versus horizontal transparency. So horizontal transparency being this idea that the corporation or the target is a black box, and that horizontally we're going to look outside of it, while vertically you have a kind of institutional structure, and that might be a single corporation, or it might be like a voluntary industry body of some kind. And the transparency goes upwards within that organization. So to provide an example, the Global Network Initiative is an organization that was started in 2008 to respond to human rights violations kind of perpetuated by and through tech platforms in China. And as a part of joining the GNI, companies agree to undergo basically audits and issue transparency reports. But much of this information is not horizontal, it's actually vertical. So people who are in the GNI, people who are on the GNI board can see that information, but outside the public might not. And we put our kind of analysis of as many of these transparency measures that were instituted by the major platforms in the last decade as we could kind of get our hands on into three main buckets. So the first is voluntary transparency. This is kind of self-regulation. But interestingly, there's been a shift in the last 5 years, especially from the kind of tradition of the target of this voluntary transparency actually being governments. So platforms, for example, issuing transparency reports around content removal requests from third parties, from governments, which I'm sure Daphne Keller and Patty are going to talk about in the next presentation. as well as, more recently, kind of internal facing transparency, self-transparency, where the firms are actually the target of their own transparency efforts. So this is things like APIs that might be used by researchers. These are ad archives. These are community standards reports, and vice versa. The second kind of big bucket are mandated transparency regimes. And these are things that are basically binding, that might be as part of the consent decree, for example, as the company Facebook and Google had a consent decree with the FTC in 2012 around privacy violations, or things like the NetzDG or the European Code of Conduct around disinformation that was mentioned. And then the kind of final and perhaps least institutionalized bucket is this idea of third-party transparency, which is basically us. So this is whistleblowers, this is investigative reporting, this is the role of academics in basically shedding light on the practice and the impact of these companies to a wider audience. So I don't have time to get into all of this here, and I'd encourage all of you to check out the paper if you're interested in this. But there is a really interesting discussion about the kind of limitations of these specific implementations, both mandated and voluntary in practice, right? So Megan Gray, who was at Stanford, had a really interesting paper from a few years ago about these public FTC privacy audits, which were being heralded as a potential, real transparency boon for, researchers and civil society to know how Google and Facebook and other companies were conducting their kind of privacy and data protection, data processing activities. And, noting that the audits are voluntary and they evaluate so few points and are so vague or duplicative as to be completely meaningless. Similarly, Emily Helt, my colleague here in Berlin at the Hague, has written that it is not enough to require companies to publish transparency reports if the information they contain has no real informative value. And she's talking about the NetzDG reports in particular and the critiques as to their actual limited value, not just for academics, but for regulators. And now actually in the effort to kind of reform the NetzDG through some amendments, this has been a target of some of the proposals that are going on and are being debated right now, how to improve the transparency reports. But actually her point, I think, stands to perhaps all transparency reporting that is public facing by companies, where a lot of researchers will say, okay, great, we have bulk numbers about the amount of content that is being taken down, but how do we actually use this in a study? What does this actually tell us, right? And similarly, Patty Learson and his colleagues at Amsterdam have been doing great work on ad archives and on the problems of labeling ads, for example. And the challenges of actually identifying political issue ads in a transparency mechanism and making that usable and tangible and meaningful for regulators and researchers. So as a kind of top line takeaways, I mean, this is a very much kind of scoping piece with history and literature and some kind of specific policy applications. While there's obviously trade-offs here, and the literature I think is quite split between kind of objective, or rather I should say, obviously it's subjective, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of optimists and pessimists and it's difficult to sift through. There are obviously going to be trade-offs between the public usefulness versus expert usefulness versus regular usefulness of these different initiatives. But I think what we're seeing now is not necessarily a bad thing, in that we're seeing multiple overlapping transparency regimes, and not all of these will be able to achieve all the different goals, all the different targets, all the different audiences. But getting more initiatives and more detail is probably a good thing. So is more oversight to fight what you might call transparency theater, just empty transparency as public relations. I think we end on, I guess, a cautiously optimistic note, serving all of this saying, listen, this is such a nascent domain that we have so little transparency and we have had so little transparency, and these developments are still so new, so underdeveloped, still have so much work that can be done to refine them, that more transparency probably isn't going to hurt. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see, the Digital Services Act in the EU and steps going forward as these transparency regulations start getting teeth. So that's it for me. Thanks so much again for having me. Here's some further reading with a paper from Patty and some folks in Amsterdam, and as well as a book as Mikkel Fliverboom on transparency if y'all are interested. So thanks so much and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Robert, for that. And so a couple of questions that have come up, and we have about 5 minutes left for questions here if others want to introduce those into the Q&A. But Laura Bosek brings up this question around the value of transparency in theory versus in practice. and whether we see that gap because of a problem with the implementation of transparency initiatives, or if there is some fundamental issue with transparency theory that may be overlooked here.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there was this quote I was thinking of putting up from Christopher Hood, who's a political scientist who also studies this, which was kind of talking about the appeal of transparency theory being in its kind of inherent ambiguity. That when you look from 10,000 feet, the idea of transparency probably seems as a good thing to almost everyone. Where the rubber really meets the road in terms of its implementation is where things get tricky. So in that last paper I mentioned from Patty Learson and Jeff Auslus and some colleagues at Amsterdam, I think they did really wonderful work looking at some actual tangible studies from other domains where there were basically mandated data sharing and transparency regimes that were implemented with varying levels of success. So I think right now in this space, just because we don't have that many data points yet, my inclination is to say, let's try some different types of implementation, right? Not just purely voluntary ones, and kind of see where that takes us. Again, I think there is a literature in the kind of machine learning space. There's a great paper by Kate Crawford and Mike Anany looking at some of these bigger theoretical pitfalls and how in the machine learning and data protection spaces, which have been, I think, a bit ahead of this curve, a few years more work looking at this. They have some misgivings about the ability of this to actually provide good governance. So I think we can't really forget all the other policy levers that are available to us, but I think this can probably be, one tool in the toolbox as a complement to a bigger public policy strategy.
Great, thanks, Robert. And one other question for you, which is one that I've been grappling with for a bit, and it's around where specifically we would like to see more transparency. And one of the things that I've observed is that the platforms in the last few years have become quite transparent about things that are happening on the platforms. I mean, with varying degrees of implementation success, but they're sharing archives about political ads. They've been sharing through Social Science One data about URLs and how often they're shared. So they're sharing, who's doing what on our platforms. And they're sharing quite a bit about what governments or others are asking of them, takedown requests, video requests, and so forth. But there seems to be this glaring gap in platforms sharing anything about what their own institutional activities are doing to impact the information environment. And so to this point that was mentioned in your remarks, I think also in your paper, about are people sort of bearing the lead in tons of data? Are we actually getting the meaningful transparency that will actually allow policy change? And so I'd be curious if you could see 3 or 4 areas where increased transparency would be helpful, assuming we could get to the implementation actually functioning, what might those be?
Yes, no, that's a brilliant question, Kelly, and I think that's right on the head, right? I mean, you can make an argument, and maybe a slightly more cynical argument, that many of these areas which have received transparency have been in ones which are, not existential threats to the business model, for example, or the implementations have been such that, they've been narrow enough where they don't distract from kind of the broader agenda, right? So the political advertising space is a really interesting one, where you also have the kind of influence of potential government regulation or third-party action through the Honest Ads Act, and then the kind of arbitrage that these transparency initiatives take on when the companies say, oh, actually, we've just implemented everything in this regulation ourselves, so you don't have to do it, right? But of course, it's not binding, and the part of the details, are probably not what researchers wanted. But again, you can really take the wind out of the sails of, public and governmental pressure for something when you say, okay, we've implemented 90% of what you've done. But I think exactly on that kind of public policy side is the thing that I would really love to see more kind of transparency. And I don't know if the companies are going to give it themselves, or if that's going to be up to researchers and civil society to almost kind of reverse engineer this through the back door. So like things like registries of, who the companies are meeting with and where they have employees and who's doing public policy work, and trying to unearth, where money is being spread around, these kinds of things. Of course, these are really challenging to do in like a robust, large scale way empirically. So it ends up being more small journalistic evidence is, kind of scattershot. But I think, yeah, that's absolutely kind of the direction I would like to see us go. And I hope that we will go.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I think that's an important point, that it's not just transparency on what they are doing on their platforms, but in terms of lobbying expenses as well, now that some of these companies are in the top 10 lobbyists in the US. Interesting to explore. Wonderful. Well, thank you for those remarks, and I'm delighted that we are managing to stay right on time. And so I want to now turn to my colleague Daphne Keller at Stanford University. She runs the program on platform regulation here at the Cyber Policy Center, and in collaboration with her colleague Patty Leersen at the University of Amsterdam, who Robert just mentioned, authored the chapter about empirical research on internet platforms and content moderation. And this was a really fantastic exploration of how intermediary liability works, what governments and platforms are trying to balance between as they are thinking about content moderation, some of the challenges in particular of over censorship when it comes to content moderation. And then Daphne and Patty also looked at some of the major sources of data and outstanding questions about what's happening online. So really happy to have you both, and Daphne, especially as a former Google lawyer, bringing a very interesting set of perspectives to these questions. So thank you both, and Daphne, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kelly. So I'm kind of a fake academic. I've only been doing this for about 5 years. And before that, as Kelly mentioned, I was Associate General Counsel at Google. And there I handled a lot of different aspects of content moderation questions, as well as a lot of other questions. Yeah, I participated in launching the first transparency report, which we didn't know was going to be a generic noun. That would then be a kind of thing that, that every company did, or hopefully will do. And I'm happy to talk more about that later, since there were interesting comments on it in the previous session. But anyhow, I'm not that much of an academic. And so when Nate asked me to write a literature review, I had to go Google the words literature review and find out what that was. And then I tried to write one. And then Patty came on board and helped fix it for me. So Patty, my co-author, is here and will join in for the Q&A, or Patty, jump in if you see me getting anything too wrong. What we put together for the book really aspires to go through a list of major sources, major known sources of empirical information about content moderation, but then also sort of to leave a good breadcrumb trail to think about where to go if you're looking for this information in the future. What are the categories, or what are the sort of means of inquiry to get this information? So what I'm going to focus on the talk is not the information itself that we discuss in the piece, but rather what these categories of disclosures are, or categories of sources of information that hopefully will be useful going forward. One big bucket that I think we all know pretty well is this sort of series of repertorial gotchas. The article saying Facebook failed to take down this bad thing, or Twitter did take down this good thing. And those are the only source of information we're going to get if platforms don't do better transparency, but B, probably not super representative. They tend to drive a discussion that's very anecdote driven, and it's very hard to know how big the underlying problem is that any one of these instances represents. Another category of empirical information, and I'm going to put her in a bucket all her own, is Kate Klonick, who is a professor at St. John's University Law School. She pioneered this technique of basically charming platform employees into violating their NDAs and telling her all kinds of really interesting things. And then she took that and did reporting that was in the legal academic reporting that was sufficiently clear-eyed and careful that actually nobody got all that mad about it. And I put her in a bucket of her own because I think she demonstrated a way of coming at the information that wasn't gotcha driven, and hopefully helped open the door toward platforms, being Facebook in particular so far, being more open to greater transparency, to expert reporters who can then go and tell the world the things that they're seeing. A third big category is the platform's own transparency reports. And as Robert was saying, we're getting more and more of these. They have better and better detail. The big platforms do cover their community guidelines or terms of service takedowns now, which they didn't for way too long. That said, also, as Robert said, there are big problems with them. They're all self-reported. These are just aggregate numbers where we have to take their word for it that this thing that was taken down as hate speech under the policy was in fact hate speech under the policy, unless and until somebody who's a sort of trusted outside expert can take a look at the actual content coming down. We don't know how accurate those numbers are, and we don't know if there are problems hidden inside those numbers, such as disparate enforcement against particular groups based on, say, ethnicity or language. So transparency reports are great. We should have more of them, but they definitely aren't enough, and they can't substitute for being able to find out what content is actually coming down or being demonetized or otherwise responded to by platforms. I think there's also a problem with transparency reporting that's worth dwelling on with this group of people, because we have all these great misinformation and disinformation researchers here, which is, if at time 0 we ask platforms to start tracking particular data, it may well be that at time 1 we realize that we wish we had some different data. We might start out thinking we need to know about ads and then realize actually we need to know about organic content. We might start out thinking we need to know about content that is false and realize that we are equally interested in content that is true, but being used in a persuasive and harmful way. And unless from time 0, the platform has been aware of the need to track that information, agreed with the need to track that information, and built it into their systems at great expense, they won't have captured the right thing. And so I sort of emphasize this now because I think we are at a political moment where we are going to have an opportunity to ask for or get lawmakers to mandate transparency, and figuring out what the priorities are, what is most useful, what serves the public good the best among the possible data we could ask them to disclose, will become important, because we're going to get something and we should figure out what the thing is that we want. A fourth big bucket that I will talk about is the Lumen database model. So this is, to my mind, almost like the Platonic ideal of how I wish transparency could work. The Lumen database was launched in probably 2003, approximately, as a shared project across a number of law schools. It's now hosted out of Harvard's Berkman Center. And they operate a database with a copy, just like a raw copy of takedown requests received by any platform that chooses to share their takedown requests with Lumen. And then how it worked until relatively recently was that any researcher who was interested in knowing what requests platforms were getting could just go dig around and see what they found. Now, there are some problems with this model. One is, it depends on the platforms voluntarily sharing things, and most platforms don't, although Google for web search and Twitter for the product broadly both share a big fire hose of data with the Lumen database. The second is that because it is something that was built within the US on US legal framing and by US participant platforms, it reflects what the legally mandated takedowns in the US mostly are, which is copyright infringement. And so in practice, Lumen has become this incredible trove of empirical information about what is going on in the moderation of infringing or allegedly copyright infringing content on the internet. And that's been amazing. It has enabled deep nuanced empirical work such as notice and takedown in everyday practice, which is the standout work in the field by Jennifer Urban, Brianna Schofield, and Joe Karaganis. So it has enabled this really incredible work that illuminates the world of content moderation broadly, but because the available data is mostly about copyright, it's always hard to know how much you can extrapolate from that to understand the larger universe of content moderation and content takedown. The third big limitation of the Lumen database is that when it works best, which is by allowing researchers to come and see what content was taken down or requested to be taken down and then not taken down. When it works best, it's because the researchers can go look at the actual content and make their own assessment of it. They can look at it and say, this is a parody, it should not have been removed. Or they can look at a large tranche of data and say, oh, there's disparate impact on female speakers. By looking at the content itself and understanding who the speaker was and who the requester for the takedown was, they are able to reach really meaningful conclusions. But the only reason that works is because these are URLs that are still live out there on the web for them to look at. You know, they're looking at things that were either links in Google Web Search results or links in tweets, and then they can go to the third-party site that persists online and see it and do research on it. This model doesn't work if what we want to understand is what people shared non-publicly on Facebook, for example, both because there was a privacy restriction on sharing it in the first place, and because once Facebook takes it down, it's gone. And so even if they reported that to the Lumen database, a researcher couldn't come along, dig into it, and really assess what's going on. But you know, I am spending this much time on the Lumen database because I think it is, as I said, almost like the Platonic ideal of how we ideally would like transparency to work, which is that there's this huge pool of data. Any researcher can come and look at it, or could until recently come and look at it. And that makes it so that you don't have to know in advance which research question you want to enable people to ask. You're not asking platforms to structure a tracking system to keep track of the information we predict researchers will care about in the future. You're instead sharing a big set of data where anyone can come along and scratch a research itch and dig up interesting information. I see that I have gobbled up more time than I had intended to, so I am not going to I'm going to wrap up relatively quickly just by saying that there's an important emerging model of so-called tiered access to data from platforms. The idea there being, well, maybe there's some content that we, for legal reasons or for other reasons, can't just put up for all the world to see the way that the Lumen database historically did. But we do want to allow credentialed researchers to look at it. And so I think there are important questions about what that might look like. And Patty has written well, and maybe he can talk a little bit about reasons to really fight for broader access and to not depend entirely on a world where the credentialed researchers get access for some sort of questions we know we want to ask, but there isn't more democratic ability to understand what's going on. Just to bang on a little bit more about why it is that we should be thinking right now about what we want in transparency from platforms in the Digital Services Act in Brussels, in the PACT Act from Senator Schatz and Thune in DC, in a number of other proposals around the world, there are draft laws being considered that would mandate specific transparency. And so since we can't, as a practical matter, mandate transparency of every single thing, the moment is now to identify what things are at the top of our request list to get better transparency so that we can solve more problems and make the world better. I will wrap up there.
Daphne, thanks so much. Yes, making the world a better place. I am a fan. I also just really +1 on your idea about just getting very specific about what we are looking for when it comes to these kinds of transparency reports. And that has been a sort of dream project of mine for a while. And so just to speak to that, and because, you know, as I've mentioned, we're thinking of writing a policy brief on this whole symposium, would love to hear your thoughts on if you had some priorities around transparency. You know, what did you like about the PACT or the digital services? What made sense to you from that? And what do you see as the future for platform transparency and content moderation here?
Well, I'll give a couple of answers, and then maybe Patty, who's done a lot more digging around in things like the political ads API, will probably have other answers. So I think one low-hanging fruit thing where we should all be asking for better transparency is from the GIFCT database. This is a set of hashes that reflect violent extremist images or videos that platforms use to automatically filter out content. And there are some really troubling examples where things like evidence collected by the Syrian Archive for Prosecution of War Crimes, got deleted from YouTube, presumably because of a filtering failure like this. And so having better access, having researcher access, because this is stuff that probably violates material support laws, you know, there are legal reasons maybe to restrict access there. But getting transparency into that in particular would be tremendously valuable. Another thing that I would really like to see is transparency, not just from platforms, but also from the other major repeat players in the land of content moderation. So if you have police, internet referral units in Europe, for example, coming to platforms and demanding content takedown, they should have their own transparency obligations. And some drafts of the pending terrorist content regulation do give them those obligations. Hopefully those will be included in the final draft. If you have NGOs who are serving as so-called trusted notifiers for things like hate speech, having transparency obligations for them, I think could be very valuable. Patty, do you have things you want to add to that?
I always love making wish lists, so I do have some ideas. Yeah, of course, there's some things that are more, you know, short-term feasible, and others have to be are only feasible in the long term. In terms of low-hanging fruit, one of the things I always like to return to is when it comes to ads, there's no need to limit ourselves, I think, to just talking about political ads. First and foremost, because it's, as many speakers have attested to, this definition of what is a political ad is extremely vague and undermines the usefulness of that data set to researchers. But also because commercial ads present many kind of public policy issues as well, right? So in addition to what Facebook and other platforms are trying to do in terms of classifying and documenting political ads, I think we can also reasonably demand a full data set of all the ads to look at for researchers. Another area where I see low-hanging fruit is when it comes to forms of content moderation that aren't removal. Why do I say that? It's because when it comes to removal, this is almost necessarily content where we've agreed, or the platform seems to think, that this data shouldn't be public. This content shouldn't be public, whether it's harmful or copyright infringing, etc. But when it comes, the platforms also do lots of other forms of content moderation, like demonetization, downranking, all these measures where they've decided, no, we're not going to remove this, but we're going to punish it in other ways, in ways that can still be very significant from a public policy perspective. And there, I think, demanding access to the content is a much more reasonable demand. So, for example, can we get a list of the videos on YouTube that have been demonetized? Can we get a list of the news articles on Facebook that have deemed to have a false headline and therefore have been downranked? So that's another area where I think much more low-hanging fruit exists. And then on the longer term, I think it's really all about also creating institutions or structures where researchers can get access to the more sensitive sides of things in a kind of confidential environment.
Great. Thank you both so much. This has been incredibly informative. And with that, we are basically wrapping our discussion of the chapters in this edited volume and turning to our editors for a last few words here. I think we're going to start first. Nate, it looks like you are going to be going first and then turning to Josh, or no, Josh is going first and then we are turning to Nate. Okay. So Josh, if you wouldn't mind giving us a few minutes of remarks, and then Nate, and then just saving 1 minute at the very end where I will cover next steps, that would be great. All right, thanks so much. Oh, and Patty and Daphne, if you can take up any questions that were in the Q&A that you would like to respond to that we didn't get to, that would be great. All right, thanks all.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. And thanks to all the panelists for the great presentations and for all the hard work that went into the chapters. And thanks to all of you who have stuck around through almost 4 hours to listen to the end of this. I'm going to just very briefly talk to you about what is sort of the manifesto at the end of this book in the closing chapter about the subject of data access. We make the point, and this sort of should, by this point, build very much on what we've heard throughout the talk today, that this is the best of times and the worst of times for access to data if we're trying to understand how human beings behave, and in particular, how human beings behave in the digital age. On the one hand, there's never been more data available to do social science with. At the same time, we're in this very weird situation, which is that after decades of social scientists being able to do research on data, basically needing data that was either produced by states that were put into the public domain, which we could call administrative data, or data that they collected themselves through interviews or survey research. Suddenly, the data that we need to understand the way people behave in society is in effect owned by and locked up inside of companies that are often the subject of the research that we're trying to do. We want to understand the impact of this new digital transformation on politics and tons of other things as well. And so we start from the point where it is beginning, we are reached a point where it is absolutely crucial that we are able to get access to data that is locked up inside of these platforms in order to inform research that is going to be put into the public domain. So that means not research that's going to be help Facebook make profits and is going to stay within Facebook, but research that is going to be in the public domain and therefore can inform citizen preferences and can inform ultimately public policy that's made around the platforms and made around just about everything in society now that so much of life is in the digital realm, and it's a fact that's been only exacerbated by the pandemic and how much more time people have spent online during the pandemic. So we start with this premise that what you want is data access. So how do you get it? Well, it's an uphill road to get it. We argue in the final chapter of the book, there are essentially 3 things you can do, all of which are fraught with problems. You can work with platforms when it is indeed possible to work with platforms. And that's been brought up recently by Robert Gora in the Social Science One initiative. Some of you are aware of a recent initiative where we're working with Facebook to try to study the impact of Facebook on the 2020 elections. These are examples of working with the platforms when it's possible. You can also work around the platforms. There are lots of techniques. This is what people have been doing, working outside of the platforms with levels of cooperation with the platforms. You can say in some ways they're sort of like you're working with APIs that the platforms put out. Maybe they weren't expressly for academic research, but the platforms are making data available. There are also ways to collect data that have nothing to do with the platform, such as running studies where you get people to download their Facebook data themselves, donate that to you, or you do things like browser tracking and installing, watching, having people install browsing tracking so you can see what people are doing online. This would be in the general category of working around the platforms. And then the final option is that you work with government to try to regulate access to data. So we try to lobby governments, we try to talk to the governments about the importance of creating a regulatory regime that's just like Daphne was talking about at the end, just like all the last platforms, creating a regulatory regime where the kind of data that we need to understand how society functions, how politics functions, how democracy functions in the digital era, where that data is available. So much of the time when you go to platforms and say, we need to work with this data, they're told, well, that's against our deal with the FTC. That's against GDPR. That's against the legal regulatory framework. So the third option is to change the legal regulatory framework. Of course, all of these are extremely challenging. There are problems inherent in all of these. If there weren't problems inherent in each of them, we would just do that one thing, right? These are all tremendous kind of uphill battles. They're all fraught with problems. We can talk about the problems that exist behind all of these. And so we argue in the book that what we need to do as researchers is to try to do all 3 of these. The reason we want to try to do all 3 of these is because it's so crucial to get the data access to inform the public and to inform public policy. We also in this last chapter begin to sort of play out some sort of bigger ways of beginning to change our thinking that might make it more likely that we're able to achieve these goals, right? So we may need to also begin to change some sort of larger questions in terms of how we think about these questions. So one of the things that we put forward in the last chapter of the book is that we want to try to engage the privacy community, but we want to try to engage the privacy community to think about privacy as a good, which we all agree is a good. People's online privacy is something that is beneficial, and we want to maximize people's online privacy. However, there is a trade-off between the farthest extent where you would maximize online privacy, which is to essentially say, let's lock up all the data within the platforms, let's never allow any data out of the platforms, in which case we live in a world where the only people who are benefiting from the analysis of data that has been provided by the citizenry to social media companies is the social media companies themselves, who in the short term will use that data to maximize profits, and in the long term will use that data to maximize whatever they want to maximize, versus another good, which is that public access to information that can be learned from analyzing platform data, right? As more and more of our life goes online, as more and more of our life is in this digital information environment that we find, if we want to understand how society functions, we're going to need to be able to access platform data. And if we want public policy that's informed by rigorous scientific analysis, these data are going to have to be made available to people who will put their findings from their research into the public domain. So the first paradigm shift is to get away from thinking of privacy online as unambiguously good. It is a good, but there is a trade-off, and there's a trade-off between two goods. One, which is policies that do the most to safeguard user privacy. The other is policies that provide for public access to information to be learned from analyzing platform data. And what we want to try to do is sort of maximize both of these goods, but at times we're going to have to think about this in terms of the trade-off and what's the optimal outcome for society. A second big picture question, which has been talked about previously today, is should we consider platforms as the owners of the data they collect with exclusive rights to insights from the analysis of that data? There is this idea of beginning to think of platforms as data fiduciaries or stewards, data stewards. So we talk about this in the chapter, and we reference other research where people begin to talk about this idea, but this strikes us as incredibly important. We live in a world right now where Facebook gets to decide what to do with the data provided by users to their platform. Should that be the property rights regime that we are embracing here? And finally, one thought that we raised in the last chapter that's probably a little bit more out there is, should we think about collecting data to be used for the public benefit the same way we collect money to be used for the public benefit from companies? So we are long used to the fact that companies don't get to keep all of their profits. They have to return some of their profits to the state that provides them with the infrastructure that allows them to earn profits, roads, courts, public defense. Should we be thinking about data in that way as well? Should we be thinking about, as you get above a certain level of data that you've collected on human beings, that a portion of that data should be returned to society to be used in society's interest? So we raise all of these 3 points in the closing chapter as ways to begin to think about this question, inform our thinking about data access. I'm going to pass it over to Nate now, who's going to take it from here and talk a bit more about the legal and regulatory regimes in that third pillar of our 3-pillar of working with the platforms, working around the platforms, and working with states to try to regulate data access. Nate?
So since I'm the last speaker at this conference, let me try to tie things together. It looks like my background has also become green at the same time. I want to explain why the issue of data availability ends up being the touchstone for everything that we've talked about in this volume and in the policy chapters. When Josh and I tweeted a few weeks ago our aggressive statement that we argue for government compulsion of social media data for researchers, some in the Twitter space said, "Oh, what a surprise that professors want the government to give them free data," right? That doesn't seem like that seems like a relatively self-interested enterprise. But as I think the chapters in this volume explain, the availability of data from the social media companies is a prerequisite for any public policy in these various domains, whether it's hate speech or disinformation, whether it's polarization, political advertising, the media environment, and the like. These are data monopolies, right? And that's what makes public policy around them so difficult, is that they own the information that will allow for governments to make informed judgments about what the proper policy should be. And so while we focus in this last chapter on the making data available to academics, as you can see from the earlier chapters from Robert Gora and Timothy Garton-Nash and Patty Learson and Daphne Keller, the transparency regimes are also the way to get these platforms to change course in a number of areas. And this also, I think, is highlighted by Frank Fukuyama and Andy Grado's chapter, in which, as Frank mentioned, in thinking about the antitrust problem, it requires that there be the creation of some kind of middle layer of companies that, while not having complete access to the data, can take advantage of the data that these companies have, right? And so I want to try to, at least for those who are not academics who are watching these presentations, to explain why the data monopolies that we are studying in this volume, why it's so important that we use all the tools at our disposal to dislodge the data from them in order to make informed public policy. As Josh mentioned, Josh talked about the privacy transparency trade-off. And I think all of us need to, this is, I think, a problem with popular writing in this area in general, but all of us who are involved in it need to recognize the trade-offs of any particular value that we're seeking to maximize here, right? And so we have reached a stage when research on social media companies is becoming more difficult from a privacy standpoint than medical research in some respects. And we need to right that balance. And there are technological solutions to this, or mitigations, and then there are policy interventions. We have been trying through the Social Science One effort to deal with this privacy problem by emphasizing differential privacy. This is new forms of technology that will allow researchers to analyze aggregated data in a way that will not reveal individual characteristics. There are serious downsides to going the differential privacy route, at least the way that we've done it at Social Science One, or the way that Facebook has been willing to do it. They are only making aggregated data available through sort of widespread distribution through Social Science One, and that's insufficient in order to analyze some of these questions, but it's a step in the right direction. You'll see, of course, that the Census Bureau has also adopted differential privacy in the data that it's making available through its more granular data sets. But that's a technological solution. There's another aspect of this, which is that in some ways we need to study these platforms before they become irrelevant, because especially when you get outside the United States and the West, the issue is WhatsApp, or as some in the chat had mentioned, Telegram and some of these other some of these other encrypted platforms. And if our conversations and interactions move to these more encrypted communication platforms, in some ways we will not be able to study most of the phenomena that form the core of this book. One of the things we talk about in this concluding chapter is how political scientists and others are sort of taking a page out of the anthropologist's guidebook here, where people are now, if they want to study WhatsApp groups or want to study some of these encrypted communications, have to embed themselves in communities in the same way that anthropologists did back when they would, live in particular communities for some time. That creates all kinds of other ethical problems of when you announce yourself, how often you announce yourself, so everybody knows that they are being observed and the like. So I think that the privacy challenges are real, and we need the governments to put a thumb on the scale to make very clear what the pathway for safe researcher access is to these data. And so I've been working with Rebecca Trumbull, Claes de Vries, and several others in Europe to try to make it very clear what the pathway is under GDPR for researchers to get access, and also to see whether we could have a formalized regime in Europe similar to what we have to accessing IRS and census data in the United States, so that individual researchers could be vetted by the government, could be given access to certain data, but would also be under criminal penalties if they engage in the kind of actions that those who gave rise to the Cambridge Analytica scandal did. So I think that that is where I think the future is going to lead, because if you're Facebook and you're staring down a $5 billion FTC fine, or if you're other platforms and you see all the action that's going against you in the antitrust realm and others, I think that that you need the government to right the balance there and to say, all right, not only are you permitted to give researcher access, but you must give researcher access. And so therefore you can't just raise the privacy objections and say that's the only interest that needs to be furthered here. I think I just want to thank, since I'm the last speaker, all the writers of these chapters, all the authors, for contributing and for their patience throughout. It has been a 2-year slog to get this out. The social media environment has become even more complicated since we first started this endeavor, but these questions have not gone away. If anything, they've become more pressing. Thank you to CSMAP and the Cyber Center, especially Kelly and Zeev, for putting all this together, and Michelle Pualuan, who did all the technical work to put all this together as well, and David Havasey. We have a great staff here at the Cyber Center, and thrilled that we could put this together. And this will be, just the latest in a series of seminars that we'll be having in the Cyber Policy Center on these kinds of issues. And we'll be continuing talking about it after the election as we see how social media affected American democracy. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Great, Nate. Thank you so much. And let me join you in just thanking, well, first of all, you and Josh for taking on what I understand has been a Herculean task of editing all of this. And again, to double down on your thanks to the co-authors, to the Center for Social Media and Politics for partnering with us on this, and Zeev, all of your work there. And also to David and Michelle and Tara and Jody and everyone else on our team who have just been remarkable in helping pull this all together. So thank you, everyone. We are going to share an article summarizing these events and the recording itself in the next few weeks. And then we'll also have a policy brief outlining the policy highlights from this conversation that will come out later this month. That will be sent to all registrants. So you will be receiving that. And then I know that Zeev had shared in the chat box a little bit about some upcoming events at the Center for Social Media and Politics. So you can find that there. And then in terms of upcoming events, if you don't mind, one of my colleagues can pull up a slide that will show what we have coming up. As Nate noted, we're doing events every couple of weeks. We have one on China and technology that Andy Grotto, whom you heard from earlier, will be hosting tomorrow. And then after that, we will be looking at questions around race and technology, the rise of digital authoritarianism, which will be a 4-day conference. I believe it's 2 or 4 hours a day between 9:29 and 10:09. We will then have a conversation about digital media literacy, and a few others that I would highlight will be our elections debrief, which will feature almost everyone from the Cyber Policy Center the day after the elections. The piece that Frank will be doing on antitrust and the tech platforms, which will go much deeper into some of the work that he outlined on that topic earlier. And then we will be having a day-long elections debrief with some of the colleagues, for example, from the political ads work that was discussed earlier, and that will be on the 10th of December. So looking forward to all of that. And thanks again to everyone here for joining us, to the Social Science Research Council for making much of this possible, and again, to all of the authors. So take care, everyone, and thanks for us staying on time and for a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.